for this year's conference is Followership, a New Approach to Understand Leadership. To introduce myself, my name is Nakyu Lee, and I go to NYU. I was an intern of the East Asia Institute last year, and as a member of EPIK Spiders this year, I'm honored to stand here, and I'll be emceeing the conference today. EPIK was founded in 2009 and has gone through the last 5 years to encourage young scholars from various backgrounds to build a comprehensive knowledge base. Okay, so today's conference will proceed with an opening session followed by 2 discussion sessions. We'll now begin the opening session with an opening remark followed by 2 very special guests. First, we'll hear from Min-sun Koo, the president of EPIK Spiders this year. Please welcome him with a big hand.
Good afternoon, President Suk-jung Lee, Professor Ji-yeon Song, Hon-ju Jung, and EAI staff member, paper presenters, panelists, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Min-sun Koo from Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University, and I stand before you today as the president of 2015 EPIK Spiders Committee. And I have to confess that I apologize on the behalf of this year's president and vice president because they were unable to attend the conference today, so sorry. When I was first told to give the opening address, I had no idea what to say because of 2 reasons. Number 1, I'm not part of this year's EPIK Spiders Committee. Number 2, I'm not an EAI intern either, so I can't really give you a meaningful background on this year's theme or the year-long efforts put in by this year's EPIK Spiders committee members. You must be wondering then, why am I standing here before you? Am I even part of the East Asian Institute? Well, I actually took part in the Sarangbang program this year spring, and my fate with EAI was not going to end there when we came back from our 3-day field trip to Kyushu, Japan in late June. Unknowingly and, well, knowingly, I was kind of put into the EPIK Spiders committee. Well, it means extracurricular commitment for me, but nonetheless, I must say that I'm very thankful for the golden opportunity to work with distinguished peers who are from diverse disciplinaries and universities across the globe. Now, to say a few words about this year's theme, followership, new approach to understanding leadership, personally, I think that there are 3 obvious keywords that we must address today. Number 1, followership. Number 2, leadership. And number 3, the word new. Well, when I first came across this topic this year, I find it very creative, yet at the same time very provocative and very challenging. I have to admit that I did try to search on the background information because I was interested in taking part in this year's conference, but I gave up. So I personally would like to say I respect all our 4 presenters today because they had the courage to actually tackle this very challenging theme. And I'd like to wish them all the best for their presentations. And we have 4 papers being presented today, all on different topics ranging from organizational management to international relations. So I'm very much looking forward to the 4 presenters. We also have very diverse panelists from both domestic and overseas universities. So today's conference will be divided into 2 sessions. The first session will be led by Professor Ji-yeon Song from Sagang University, and the papers are less related to international relations. The second session moderated by Professor Hon-ju Jung from Yonsei University. The 2 papers presented in the second session are much more related to international relations at both regional and global level. As an IR major myself, I'm very much looking forward to the second session and the discussion following that. Well, lastly, I would like to thank East Asian Institute and the people responsible for making today's conference a success. And I also like to thank the audience for taking the time off to come to our today's conference. And also, I hope to see many of you, either as presenters or panelists, in the 2015 Young Leaders Conference. Thank you.
So now we'll hear a welcoming remark delivered by President Suk-jung Lee, the president of East Asia Institute. Please welcome her with a warm hand.
Usually just after lunch, my voice tends to break down, so just understand me. On behalf of East Asia Institute, I'd like to welcome everyone, the presenters and discussants, and also audience. As you know, this EPIK Young Leaders Conference started as an essay competition 5 years ago, and without the support from Samyang Corporation, we couldn't continue this important program. And this EPIK Young Leaders Conference is a very important pillar of EAI's education program. So every year when I see the chosen papers to be presented today, tend to be very excellent, considering the most presenters are undergraduate and some are graduate. So I think the future of academic intellectual capability of South Korea is going to be very promising, considering your capacity. And I heard this year you pick up the fellowship, and heard that some found it very difficult to carry out research because there are not much written on fellowship. I fully understand, because I myself wrote the one paper about the fellowship in Korean politics. It's not easy because most literature is about leadership, not the fellowship. But unless there is a fellowship, it's very difficult for the political and social leaders to govern this country. And I guess one of the challenges South Korea is facing is how we generate this voluntary fellowship to make our politics and our governance more stable. So I think that you tackled important topic. I'm sure this fellowship is not just applying to Korean politics, it applies to international politics, considering the globalization and democratization of countries in the world. So I'm very looking forward to reading your papers when I go back to my office. And then for today's conference, of course, I'd like to thank the two professors who decided to review all these papers from the beginning to the final decision process. Professor Song Ji-yeon and Professor Chung Eun-gu of Yonsei University. I think this evening, I think we're gonna find out who's the winner. I guess the spirit of this competition is not just choosing the winner, and when there is a winner, of course there is a loser. But I guess everyone agreed that there is no special meaning of winning or losing. The whole spirit is participating in this important exercise, intellectual exercise, and by engaging in this kind of activity, I'm sure you will increase your capacity, intellectual capacity, as a promising young scholar or young policy leaders in the future. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope 2 consecutive sessions is going to be very interesting and exciting. Thank you.
Now we'll begin the first session of today's conference. The first session will be led by Professor Ji-yeon Song from Seogang University. Please give her a big hand and let me hand over the floor.
First of all, thank you so much for President Suk-jong Lee and also EAI to invite me to here. And this is my first time to join the EPIK conference, and I really enjoy this process. And especially this year's theme is as EPIK committee with Min Sung-gu, so she mentioned it is very challenging theme, but we had very interesting papers this year. So I'm happy to just moderate this session. Basically, today's EPIK conference is divided into 2 sessions. The first session is more is 2 papers in the first session are not very like each other. However, each paper is very interesting and excellent paper. So the first theme is about the fellowship in the organization. The second one is about the fellowship in the especially climate change settings. So today what I'm going to do, first we will have 2 presentations by 2 presenters. So each presenter will have between 20 and 25 minutes presentation. And then we will have, we are going to have the 2, we have 2 designated discussants for each paper. So after that, I will just wrap up some the discussions and some questions, and then I will open to the floors. So that's kind of the organization of the today's session. So I think the Hyun-Soo, she will just have her presentation first, and then we will have In-Seo Kim's kind of presentation today. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hyun-Soo Lee, and I'm studying corporate communication at the University of Amsterdam. First of all, I would like to thank you, all of you, for giving me opportunity to be here and to present the paper. So, shall we start? I'm going to talk today about the influence of the followership and the mediating effect of the communication climate. I've been looking up the past followership research, and it has been shown that there is a very little amount of the followership research, and moreover, there is most of the followership research has been dealt with adopting with the contents analysis. So mainly interpreted by own researcher, by ownself. So the current paper, I'd like to examine actually this followership actually works for the organization, and what could be the determining factor for the followership to be well performed in the organization. First of all, I'd like to address the sweeping viewpoint of the followership research. Past research mainly consider followership and followers as more like subordinate, the recipients of the leader's influence. And then they're more considered as the supporters or assistants of the leaders. However, there's a sweeping change. The understanding of the followership has appeared. And according to the Mindel and the co-researchers, followers should be considered as the organizational role. So the leadership is operationalized as the sum of the perception of the followers, and then what is important is followers' thoughts and followers' belief of the leadership completes the leadership process. So in this context of new understanding of the followership, followers should be seen as the constituents of the leader. So which becomes prior to the leader, which is antecedents of the leadership process. So in this context, followership and followers are seen as more like co-contributor or partner with leaders. So this changing concept of the followership drew the attention of the organization and many international companies, because it changed the influence, how much employees can perform in the organization, and what organization should focus on, should expect on the employees. So many of the research pointed out that followership, most important characteristic of followers are productivity, like more initiating and more like actively engage with the organization. So this proactivity enables followers or employees to actively engage with the organization, which lead them to have more high job involvement and work involvement. So they are more highly involved with the organization, which means it is likely that they have high level of organizational identification. Organizational identification refers to the degree to which how individual employees identify themselves towards the organization they belong, or how much they feel oneness or belongingness toward the organization. So this high level of organizational identification facilitate individual employees' job involvement or the job commitment, which facilitate the employees to be engaged in the decision-making process, and which makes leadership process function very smoothly. So I'd like to discuss 3 main points of the current presentation of my research. First of all, I adopted Kelly's followership scale, which divided into 2 behavioral dimensions. So how I'd like to ask myself, like how these two behavior dimensions of the followership is related to the organizational identification. And second, according to the previous literature review, communication climate was pointed out as the mediating effect, influential effect for the to the extent of the followership to be exerted on the organizational identification. So therefore, second point is how does the communication climate mediates the influence of the followership on the organizational identification. And third of all, according to the previous literature review, how the network centrality was pointed out as the having the interacting effect with the followership between the followership and the organization. So the third point of research question is how does the network centrality interact with the influence of the followership, the two characteristics of the followership on organizational identification. So first of all, let's look into the two behavior characteristics of followers. Kelly is one of the first researchers to determine the behavior characteristic of effective followers. And Kelly addresses that effective follower has holding two representative behavior characteristics. First is active engagement, and the other one is independent critical thinking. Active engagement refers to the level of participation or engagement in the organization, how much employees are actively engaged with the organization, and how much they are initiating new projects without much of supervision. And second is independent critical thinking. Independent critical thinking refers to the level of mindfulness, how much they are making more critical remarks for the improvements in the organization, how much they are cultivating thoughtful insights, how much they are accepting fresh new ideas. So basically these two dimensions are interacting with each other, since both the effective followers can foster both of the behavior qualities. However, it has not proven yet that these dimensions is correlated. So let's look into the relationship between followership and organizational identification. Active engagement of the followership, this enables followers, this proactivity of the active engagement enables followers who having this right quality perceive the job responsibility as more like make an effort to solve the job the problems in the organization, and more like accomplish the shared goal in the organization. So they are more likely to contribute it and more likely committed to the organization. So this proactive participation leads employee to higher job engagement and commitment to the organization, which is likely to lead higher organizational identification. So first, hypothesis 1A expects that active engagement will have a positive relationship with the organizational identification. The second of all, independent critical thinking. Independent critical thinking, followers are more like analyzing and making a judgment, and more like evaluating the situation. So it is very likely for them to perceive the negative sides of the job problems in the organization. And this awareness of the negative side of the organization or their job, it is likely to prevent them to feel more like belongingness or oneness in the organization. So hypothesis 1B expects that independent critical thinking will have negative relationship with the organizational identification. And relationship between followership and communication climate. Active engagement of the followership, they have actively engaging followers are more like proactive, and then they are likely hold strong efficacy to engage in communication within the organization. And since they are more proactive in their communication, they are more likely their suggestions are well heard and well accepted by the organization. And the confidence established by accumulation of this experience in expressing their opinions, and their opinions being well heard, make them make them to perceive the organizational communication climate as more positive, as more open or participative. Therefore, it is expected that hypothesis 2A suggests that active engagement will have positive perception of active engagement will predict positive perception of the communication climate. And independent critical thinking. Independent critical thinkers are feel more like recognized when their criticism was accepted as a constructive suggestion in the organization. So once their criticism was accepted as a constructive suggestion for the organization, they feel well considered and they become more participative, more actively engaged with the organization. Therefore, the criticism well accepted, the communication climate, the very open communication climate, and independent critical thinking followers has the relationship between each other. And it is expected that hypothesis 2B suggests independent critical thinking will predict positive perception of the communication climate. And the relationship between communication climate and organizational identification. Communication climate was, according to the previous literature by Schmidt and co-researchers, communication climate was known to have positive relationship with organizational commitment. And organizational commitment is one of the predictor for the organizational identification. So, for example, an open and participative communication climate can positively affect employees to speak out, like open up their mind and more like giving a suggestion, and then and feel more easily to give a suggestion to the organization. And it is likely that they are feeling more accepted by the organization. They are being taken seriously. So therefore, they're highly likely to perceive themselves as an in-group member of the organization. So hypothesis 3 suggests that communication climate will be positively related to organizational identification. And as I mentioned earlier, the active engagement of the followership has positive relationship with organizational identification as well as communication climate. And communication climate also has positive relationship with organizational identification. So therefore, when communication climate in this hypothesis could function as a mediating factor for the relationship between active engagement and organizational identification. So it is expected that, as hypothesis 4A, that communication climate will partially mediate the effect of the active engagement on organizational identification. And in terms of the independent critical thinking has positive relationship with communication climate, and also independent critical thinking is expected to have a negative relationship with the organizational identification. And once communication climate was involved as the mediating factor, the relationship between independent critical thinking and organizational identification changed as positive relationship. So therefore, hypothesis 4B suggests that communication climate will mediate the effect of the independent critical thinking on organizational identification. And then, as suggested earlier as third point of the research question, the network centrality was pointed out as the influencer factor as well for the for individual communication climate, perception of the communication climate. High network centrality of the individual is attributed to the strong social capital and social integration in the organization, and then for employees with high level of network centrality, they are more likely to develop the network in the organization, and then in this case, employees are feel more easily to communicate with other organizational members. So followership in general, actively engaging followers as well as independently critical thinker, both of them are likely to benefit from achieving high network centrality. So So in this case, network centrality will have interaction effect with influence of the followership on communication climate. So based on the hypothesis suggested, the conceptual model was created. This is the conceptual model for the active engagement. So as I noted mentioned earlier, active engagement has positive relationship with the communication climate as well as organizational identification. And then communication climate will be mediating factor for the relationship between active engagement and organizational identification. And network centrality could be the is expected to have an interaction effect with active engagement on the communication climate. And this is a second conceptual model of independent critical thinking. Independent critical thinking is expected to have a positive relationship with communication climate, but negative relationship with organizational identification. And once communication climate was involved as a mediating factor, then independent critical thinking, the relationship between independent critical thinking and organizational identification turned out to be positive. So in this case, it's a full mediation. And also independent critical thinking followers will benefit by achieving high network centrality, which makes them to perceive the communication climate as more participative and open. So this is a conceptual model, and most of the followership research was adopting the qualitative research. So I wanted to empirically investigate, and also what could be also the mediating effect could be actually involving in the process. So I adopted quantitative research online survey. The online survey was conducted from 1st of May till 18th of May in 2014, and total 112 respondents participated. So this is the analysis result. The active engagement seems to have a connection with the variables that I mentioned, and in terms of the independent critical thinking, doesn't have a significant relationship with variables or organizational identification, communication climate, and network centrality. And there was no network centrality. There was no interaction for the network centrality with followership variables, let's say active engagement and independent critical thinking on communication climate. So, however, the research shows that the active engagement is actually a positive predictor of the positive perception of the communication climate. Also, communication climate was highly positively related to organizational identification, and active engagement is also directly has a main effect on the organizational identification. And in terms of the mediation, I conducted multiple regression analysis, and the positive main effect of active engagement on the organizational identification was originally beta value 0.429. However, when communication climate was involved in the regression analysis as included in the conceptual model, then the main effect of the active engagement on organizational identification has decreased as beta value 0.364. So therefore, in this case, communication climate is mediate the effects of active engagement and organizational identification, which means that no matter how followers, employees have active engagement quality, when communication climate was negative, such as not open, not trustworthy, then it is likely that this quality does not have an effect on their organizational identification. So all in conclusion, so The current paper suggests the organization that based on the research analysis, research result, I suggest the organization such as that the organization should consider investing attracting these kind of employees with these kind of qualities, especially the active engagement qualities, or organization should consider training employees to develop such kind of qualities. Also, organizations should empower employees to be part of the decision-making process and to be involved in creating shared goal and expectations, and then to make employees to be encouraged to be more initiative in the organization, which is aligned with the positive communication climate. So communication climate turned out to be a mediating factor. So which is determining factor to increase the organizational outcomes, organizational performance. So therefore, I suggest that for organization, it is important to facilitate open and participative communication, the communication climate. And so organization can support the disagreement of employees and lead the possibilities for employees to change the orientation of the organization. Also, organization can encourage exchange thoughts of the organization matters between the employees, and then which makes employees to have strong ties between each other, not only between each other but also towards the organization. And then also organization could consider investing not only psychological but also physical support for employees. For example, physical support means such as the working benefit or satisfying employees' individual needs. So when they have these benefits from the organization, they're more likely to feel well taken care of by the organization. They're more likely to feel taken seriously in the organization. So they will have the higher organizational identification. Also, collecting feedback from employees could be one of the important assignment for the organization as well, in terms of the not only for the solving internal matters, but also representing organizational communication climate as more accepting, participative, and open, trustworthy. Yeah. And limitation as well as suggestion for the future research would be, in this hypothesis, the causal relationship is not well discovered. So the future research can adopt the other methods, such as like experimental or longitudinal research design. Also, the network centrality was measured with quite experimental methods. So this method can be validated in the future research. And in terms of the social desirability bias, because the survey was the self-reported, so there will be a room for social desirability bias involved. So in this case, the future research can adopt different research methods such as ethnography to prevent the social desirability bias. So all in all, in conclusion, my research paper aims to discover the influence of the actual influence of followership. So among followership characteristics, active engagement characteristic of followership has actually influenced the employees to identify themselves organization with more higher chances, and communication climate of the organization becomes the influencer factor, determining factor for the employees to have higher organizational identification. Also, so the organization can consider the major implications from my research, and then future followership research can focus on the limitation or suggestion from my research, and then conducted more meaningful, more empirical followership research. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for Hyunsu's great presentation. So I know that you have lots of questions and suggestions based on her presentation, but hold your question and comments for a while. And then we will have a second presenter, In Kim. She will present her paper at 20 minutes or so. Right.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research paper and the EPIK conference. It's a great pleasure. So when I first heard about this topic about followership, I thought it would be a very interesting topic. Well, I'm sure that many of us here would have heard about the virtues of leadership. And same for me. However, I never felt that there was enough emphasis on followership. And I thought it would be really interesting to actually discover how the importance of followership, not only at an individual level, but also at a national level. So the question I pose today is this. Can followership facilitate international cooperation in climate change negotiations? And my answer to that is yes, and it should be an area that should be explored further. And due to the time constraint, I'll mainly focus on my understanding of followership, and I will analyze the three actors within the framework, who are leaders, middle powers, and followers. Okay, so to begin with, what exactly is followership? So I guess traditionally, our understanding was based on the quality of certain leaders or follower type. So I guess we think of leaders as like an extrovert with a vision, whereas followers were seen as more of a passive role with lack of an initiative. However, I believe that this kind of understanding is oversimplistic. And I think that followership should be understood in these terms. First of all, there are various types of followers. In the literature, there are various types, including bystanders, active participants, or in some cases, a rival to the leader. And in many occasions, that current literature has actually taken this into account and introduced terms such as follower-centric approaches to leadership, which actually says that leaders respond to followers, and followers can actually shape leaders' responses. However, I want to go a step further and try to analyze followership in terms of how followers view themselves in relation to the leaders. And I believe that these followership and leadership concepts are interlocked. And that I want to support the situation where all the stakeholders engage as active participants. So, why climate change, and how is followership relevant? So the reason I chose climate change as a topic was that, first of all, I thought it was a great case study in terms of demonstrating the need for a new paradigm in understanding international relations. In climate change negotiations, there are so many different coalitions of factions. I guess one of the most prominent divide is the North-South divide between the developed and the developing countries. However, even within this broad categorization, there are various factions. For instance, there's a divide between the EU and the US in terms of the strength of commitments. Even within developing countries and the G77, how you refer to them, there are countries such as the low-lying islands, which are very vulnerable to high rising sea levels, and definitely want to support a more aggressive action. And on the other hand, you have developing countries that want to prioritize economic growth. So it definitely introduces us to various cleavages and helps us to analyze different motives and behaviors of these actors. Secondly, there are two principles at hand here. So one is, as I mentioned before, the need for economic growth and the equal need for economic growth. The second is about historical accountability and the fact that developed nations should be accountable for past emissions. So it's really interesting to see how various nations try to balance these two principles. And finally, what is really important is that in climate change negotiations, a transnational cooperation is a prerequisite to find a meaningful resolution. So therefore, I thought it would be a great platform to try to apply my understanding of followership framework to this topic. Furthermore, I thought it would also be really interesting to look at the changing power dynamics within international relations. So I guess one of the main measures of, there are various measures of power, but I guess one of the most, in recent years, resource ownership is also a very important issue. And since resource ownership and energy dependency is a topic that's very closely tied to climate change negotiations, I thought it would also shed some light into this topic as well. Okay, so climate change negotiations so far. So obviously, developed countries had made some progress in terms of establishing various institutions. So there's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where scientists and experts provide reports on progress and any kind of recommendations. There have also been various international climate summits, from Kyoto Protocol to more recently Copenhagen. However, the general thing is it's very disappointing. In Copenhagen 2009, it was revealed that there has been a knowledge consensus. So most nations agreed that, okay, we should cap temperature rise by 2 degrees Celsius. The problem was there was no consensus in terms of what kind of instruments to implement in order to achieve this goal. So I guess that would be the future kind of goal and the target that the international community should go toward. Now, how climate change leadership can be developed, and what have leaders done so far? So obviously, I guess, although I emphasize the importance of followership, I still do not want to downplay the importance of leaders. The nature of the international negotiations is that it's very complex. There are more than 150 nations attending each conference, which means that nations with huge delegation size, experience, is at a much more advantage. And actually, many developing countries has expressed their difficulty in terms of getting their agenda even on the table because they didn't have enough, relations or previous contacts. So therefore, I still believe that leaders can play a huge role, and we need their contribution in order to make a meaningful progress. But even leaders use different types of leadership approach. So for instance, I guess the main Western leaders, such as the US and the EU, has been using the traditional power-based or structural leadership, which means that they use their ability to affect others' incentives so that they would accept their terms and conditions. So in the Kyoto Protocol, the main kind of clashing points were that the many developed countries wanted developing countries to also join in terms of cutting their carbon emissions. So this was called the Joint Implementation Program. So US was able to persuade some nations, such as Brazil and Argentina, to join in. However, the case is there's only so many countries that you can incentivize to follow your terms and conditions. So main developing countries, such as India and China, were aggressively opposed to this, which meant which was a huge limitation to Kyoto. Also, another approach that EU used is the diffusion of values. So values of the so-called Western countries, such as sustainable development and historical accountability, yes, it was fine for them. But the fact is, the fact that they tried to diffuse these values on these emerging economies was met with a very disgruntled response. For instance, one of the insiders in Brussels, he actually said that countries like China, they're very self-confident and they're very careful not to be influenced by other people. And a disregard of such kind of way followers view themselves meant that in many occasions, international summits led to half-hearted commitments because we didn't have all the actors pulling together in one direction. On the other hand, you have Norway. So Norway has been using a more intellectual and directional leadership. So they were mainly trying to shape perspectives of the bargaining parties. So Norway has been at the forefront of green policies for many years. What was quite difficult and tricky for them was that they are actually quite highly reliant on oil. Oil is their main kind of exports. So they had this balancing act to play. And what they chose to do is that they invested a huge amount of money in many developing countries, including Mexico and Poland, to install fluorescent lights to cut carbon emissions. So you ask yourself, why don't they just demand participation from developing countries? Why do they actually pay for them? The important fact is actually, it's really interesting, the OECD revealed that Norway would be able to achieve greater carbon reduction per unit of expenditure if investments were made abroad rather than at home. So this definitely points out to the fact that by understanding your needs and by understanding the developing countries' needs, you can actually cooperate in order to provide a win-win scenario. Next, I want to move on to the middle powers. So these middle powers can be categorized as secondary regional powers who perform special functions due to their material capabilities or political engagement. So now these countries can include countries like South Korea, Australia, and other emerging economies like Brazil, Russia, and China. So why are they so important? Because, first of all, they're one of the highest emitters now. So a lot of these countries have moved away from being a developing country to being a more advanced economies. And it's very important because they can shape the trend within their region. And actually, using the co-benefits approach, you can explain why they have changed their strategy from being a climate laggard to playing a more leading role in climate change negotiations. So let's look at China, because China is such a huge game changer. I mean, its emissions comprise of 25% of total world emissions. So China has actually changed their stance quite dramatically over the years, and the fact that they've barely done any research on the effects of climate change in the 1990s, to actually implementing very drastic domestic policies and international policies in terms of accepting clean development mechanism, and also in their 5-year plans, trying to reduce energy intensity by over 40% by 2020. And you can see that by using the co-benefits approach, is that I mentioned previously there are two principles, the principle of economic efficiency and the principle of historical accountability. The thing is, these two can go hand in hand. Your national interest and environmental protection can go hand in hand. And by realizing that, China is actually putting more effort into tackling global climate change. Sorry. However, I do not believe that co-benefit approach is the be-all, end-all. In many countries, it is not in their national interest to protect the environment. For instance, Russia and Canada actually have a lot to gain by having warmer climates. And even for China, it is actually at a crossroad in terms of their energy dependency. So, as I mentioned before, there's the huge issue of resource war. And so I guess the resource war. And what happens is that the fact that Chinese consumption has been rising hugely, which means the demand for energy is so high, that when in the past there were self-sufficient energy providers, but now they need to depend on outsourcing. So this has encouraged China to actually invest abroad, and particularly in Africa. And despite the initial expectation and optimism that China will transfer sustainable technology to Africa, many critics point out that actually, if you look at it from the inside, it's actually more like a resource exploitation. So it's very important not just to rely on economics and the economics calculus, but also for the international community to pressurize governments such as China in order to facilitate. To really raise the importance of the principle of accountability and fairness. So that point leads me to South Korea. So South Korea has recently been really at the forefront of green policies in East Asia. So it has introduced low-carbon green growth, especially championed by the former President Lee. But also, it was really interesting in 2009 in Copenhagen, because most developing countries usually announce their commitment under the name of nationally appropriate mitigation action. But South Korea was very unique in saying that their commitment do not depend and is not conditional upon international agreement, which means that regardless of whether there's an international agreement or not, we will still go on and try to keep up to this target. So I think this is quite a symbolic message in terms of kind of leading the scene and trying to kind of set a different kind of climate. And not just South Korea, but South Korea, Japan, Singapore has been engaging in this healthy competition of trying to develop sustainable technology. And I believe, yes, China is huge. China is a big dog. However, if other middle powers such as in this region try to set a different kind of climate and different kind of direction, then it can have a substantial effect. So finally, last but not the least, there are the followers. And I believe the followers play such an important role in international climate negotiations. Well, firstly, they have the huge advantage, although not in terms of resource-wise, because they are the people who bear the brunt of the harms of climate change without really causing it. Which means that engaging them in international negotiations and getting their approval is important in terms of legitimacy in international negotiations. And I believe it's very important, as I mentioned above in the definition of followership, for these followers to recognize that their important and pivotal role within the international stage so that they can actually play their part. And the thing is, followers cannot afford the status quo. A lot of African countries suffer from deforestation, and many Southeast Asian countries also experience significant harms through glacial lake outbursts and floods, which are all pretty much man-induced. But what can you do is that you can actually actively engage in the issue and try to persuade the developed countries to actually support them, and by appealing to that accountability principle. So Nepal has been doing this. So it has suffered from a lot of glacial lake outbursts in the past. However, through negotiations, it was able to secure funding from the Netherlands to support them to build a better mitigation actions. So therefore, I believe that when these parties group together to form a coalition and to really raise the awareness of the issue and put it on the agenda, it can really help to develop the low carbon development model as well. So therefore, I believe they have an important role in terms of representativeness as well as agenda setting role. So what is the way forward? Some forecasts suggest that if there's a repetition of this business as usual, what will happen is that the carbon emissions in developing countries will increase by 200%, which means that in order to reach our goal and to provide them with a fair chance of development, developed countries need to reduce their carbon emissions by 270% by 2050. Like, I don't see how that is going to happen. So, I mean, U.S. Secretary of Environment Stephen Chu, he actually mentioned in a statement that the cooperation between China and U.S. would depend on the creativity of the market to provide sustainable technology. However, I believe that there should be more action to guarantee that in case when these sustainable technology is not developed in time, that we can fully address this issue of climate change, which can have a potentially catastrophic and irreversible effects. So, some of the suggestions. Some people criticize the neoliberalism, espoused by the West, and say that it's not suitable to rely on such ideology, and suggest things such as like Green Point for cooperation, trying to engage more dynamic emerging economies to make a stronger commitment. However, the point is, as I mentioned before, leaders, followers, middle powers, they're all part of this framework and this relationship between, international relationship. So rather than trying to focus on one or the other, it's very important for each of them to recognize the motives and the behaviors of each other and try to facilitate better relationships and trying to incentivize others in those kind of framework. Right. So I really hope that my followership framework has allowed us to really understand the connection between the leaders and the following countries, but not only that, really demonstrate the importance of followers realizing their importance and their key role in international negotiations, and hopefully that they will step up through being aware of it and actually practice their strength in those terms. So I really hope that this followership will encourage more inclusive leadership, and hopefully this will alleviate some of the problems of global crisis in leadership. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So much, Inso, for your great presentation. So now we are going to have a student discussion. So we have two designated discussed for each paper. So for Hyunsu's paper, first we will have Min-sun Koo and also the Yoon-seok Chung. So I'll give you just 5 to 10 minutes for discussion, and then we will turn to Jung Hee-hyun and also the Ino Choi for your comments for Inso's paper. So after that, I will give some time for you two presenters to respond to questions or some opportunity to elaborate your argument there. And then I will just wrap up some comments and some questions, and then I will open the floor. Wanna go first, Min-sun or Yoon-seok?
I'll go first. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and when I first read your paper, I thought it was really interesting because it took a very scientific and empirical approach to the concept of followership. That was something that I could not think of. But I have a few key questions, and I have sub-questions following that. So my first question is, in the prompt of the main theme, I think you did not really conceptualize followership, especially in the 21st century. So I was wondering, how would you view followership, and do you think whether it has changed, or if it has not changed, how do you think followership should change in the new century? And similar to this first question is, how do you then view leadership? You said that leadership is defined as the sum of perceptions of followers. But I was wondering, as I read your paper, towards the conclusion, I did not really see how organizational outcome, organizational identification, and how the mitigation of communication climate actually affect leadership. In other words, do you think having all these different variables, do you think it improves leadership performance, or do you think it has no effect, or do you think it worsens leadership? I was wondering on that as well. And following that, I have another question regarding the, you pointed out active engagement and independent critical thinking based on Kelly's research. So do you think these two dimensions are the only dimensions that affect followership in the 21st century? If you were given a chance to somehow modify Kelly's research, do you think, would you change these dimensions to, for example, would you add them, or would you add on to them, or something else? And do you think, you pointed out in your conclusion that caring for employees, for example, giving them motivation, giving them physical, psychological support, to the employees, how do you think that would actually improve leadership then? Because I don't really see the link between organizational management in your conclusion and leadership. I was wondering on how the leaders would perceive what the employees, how the employees communicate, for example. And I have another question about network centrality. You pointed out that having a greater network centrality would actually help employees feel more belong to the organization. But I was wondering, if employees feel that they are in the center of the organization, then how do leaders fit in that network centrality? Does it mean that the leaders would kind of be like, move to the margin? I was wondering on that as well. And in terms of methodology, I was wondering, how did you select your sample? You say you surveyed 124 respondents. I was wondering how you selected them. And also, do you think variables such as gender, age, number of years of working, whether they are full or part-time, and their education level, their position in the organization, all these variables, how do you think these variables affect followership, in other words? I thought it would be much more interesting if you included in your analysis how these different variables affect how these employees view themselves, whether, for example, whether gender has got anything to do with active engagement, or whether education level has anything to do with independent critical thinking. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think when the 2014 conference committee was planning this conference, you are exactly the type of diverse talent they wanted to attract, especially considering that this is very focused on IR, politics, sociology. Having someone from corporate communication background actually, I think, is a big help for this conference. And I thought that it was good to have statistically significant results, which doesn't happen as often as we would like. And I think that these issues raised in the paper are something that we can consider actually beyond this realm of corporate communication, and actually extend to regional relationships among countries or other types of groups. So there are definitely a lot to talk about here. Let me just proceed by going through the paper. I don't want to sound too picky, but that's the easiest way to do it, I think. When I was reading the introduction, I was a little confused when I came upon your description of Kelly's two dimensions. And I think you could have provided a more in-depth overview of what she actually meant by these two variables and in what context she brought up these two variables. And if you go through this kind of causal relationship, causal link that you explain, you say that both active engagement and ICT contribute to communication climate, which also contribute to organizational identification. But when you're actually forming your hypothesis, you say that ICT has a negative relationship with organizational identification. So if you could have explained that kind of switch from that Kelly's framework to your own framework, I think that would have been more helpful for the readers to understand. And when I went to Kelly's description of AE again, I think that AE, the first dimension AE describes the degree to which employees actively take part in performing tasks, and organizational identification refers to perception of belongingness to organizations. And one question I had was actually if this kind of belongingness might go in hand with active engagement, or vice versa. One main question I had was, what if this kind of research was carried out in such societies as Korea, where one could argue organization identification might not contribute to or might not be correlated with active engagement or independent thinking, where sometimes organizational identification requires you to kind of give up your own thinking and follow what the leaders want. So I think kind of going back to the point about describing Kelly's framework, maybe how this framework might be limited to certain environments or cultures, maybe. And I think let's just go on to methodology. And when you list these kind of different metrics and cite different papers, I thought that it would have been more helpful if you kind of described why you picked these kinds of metrics. And perhaps that was because that was most accessible, especially considering this was only an online survey, and there might have been very valid reasons, but I might have benefited from your explanation of why you decided to pick these specific researchers' metrics. And yes, one thing that just popped up into my head was when you're measuring network centrality, you say that, or rather, this Hubert and Taggart say that they ask these two questions. Please write the names of team members who are important sources of professional advice. Also, please write the names of team members you can count on. And I just didn't really understand them, I guess, when they say that the total number of direct contacts an employee has can become a measure of degree of centrality. So I was just confused as to whether having many people write your own name as a place to go for advice, or someone to count on, is that a measure of network centrality, or having many people you can count on, having many people you can go to, is that a measure of network centrality? And I was just confused as to whether which one of those was true. And maybe another point on this metrics is that there are a lot of ways to measure this centrality. And for example, if from a sociologist's perspective, you could actually map out different social networks and measure different nodes, and those kinds of very technical metrics exist. And maybe why you decided to choose this kind of metrics is another question related to methodology. And as for the results, I think, as I said, it's really good to have these significant results. And I think that one additional maybe test that you could have done was to measure for the interactive effect between ICT and AE, which is one of the explanations you provide for kind of insignificant result of the ICT. So I think maybe that would have bolstered your research a little more and provided much more solid ground for your research. But I think overall, it raised a lot of different issues, interesting issues that we could think about, as I said, beyond this realm of corporate setting. And so thank you.
Thank you so much for Min-sun and Yoon-suk for your great comments and questions. So just need to add what they just mentioned. I just wondering, probably it's my kind of question and comments. So I think it's just one point to the defend her position is that her research based on the online survey. So actually she cannot control that much. So if she could conduct a survey, for example, one specific corporations or organization, probably it's much easier to find some questions. But just based on the nature of her online survey, probably some questions are not fully answered in the draft. But I think it's really interesting job. And my question and comments is related to what just Min-sun and Yoon-suk mentioned, and you just mentioned about the college 2 dimensions, AE and ICT. But my question relates to what two discussants mentioned, but you just mentioned in your paper, these 2 dimensions are quite different, the kind of dimension. But I was wondering, as Yoon-suk pointed out, are there any interaction effects? For example, it doesn't mean if you are independent and critical thinker, but it doesn't mean you are active engagement in your organization. So I was just asking to myself, reading your paper, what's the interaction between these 2 kind of characteristics? So it might be more interesting to just include that aspect, or you clarify why they are entirely 2 different the dimensions of the followership. And another question is one of the conceptual dimension, and I think the second one, ICT part. So there are 2 plus signs, but you're kind of the effect of the ICT to the organizational education is a negative sign, it's a minus, right? So I was wondering how these 2 negative effects are kind of came out as more kind of negative sign in your conceptual dimension. Of course, you mentioned, but they are not statistically not insignificant in your kind of findings. But conceptually, I wasn't sure how these 2 plus signs can become kind of minus sign as kind of one flaw. So that's my question. But probably we'll have more questions and comments. But I'll just hold my comments here, and then we will turn to our 2 designated discussants, Jung Hee-hyun and also the Choi for Eun-suk's presentation. Who wanna go first?
So thank you so much for your paper. I think you did a really wonderful job in terms of providing great definitions and your conceptualizations of the issue at hand and the clarifications of different actors, or the classifications of different actors. And I also think it's you smartly chose the issue. It's very timely and present issue. So, I am curious, in terms of the follower-leader framework you provide, there seems to be an emphasis that leaders prompt followers in what actions should be taken in resolving the climate change issue. But in some ways, it's ironic that the labeling of the leader is the creator of the issue. So, and in current resolutions and negotiations, the leaders don't really necessarily follow their own leadership. So if there were to be effective followership, perhaps within this framework it's not really possible. And I think a more empathetic analysis or a narrative of the followers could be given. For example, you write in your paper that India, or you say that followers should take a more active and engaging role, but you provide it as a negative followership model of India not necessarily following EU's terms and conditions of greenhouse gas emissions. So considering this, are you suggesting that the current leader-follower framework exists, and yes, if yes or no. I'm also lost whether or not the middle powers should be assuming the leadership roles, or that's not the case. And if, on the other hand, labels don't, the follower leader labels are taken out, if that's a realistic or even an efficient solution. My second comment is in the paper, in the beginning, climate change is described as an intersectoral, has an interdisciplinary nature, but I don't know if it's intentional or not, but you don't really give the sustainability or sustainable development context. So I wonder if the paper could have been taken in a more holistic approach to include those two movements to strengthen the climate change issue at hand. And parallel to that, I was wondering if you considered other levels of relationships, so other levels of stakeholders, so rather than just nation states. Is this followership model the same within nations, so government and civil society, or the public and private? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Johnny, and then we'll turn to Ino for his comment on
in such paper.
Thank you for your great presentation. When I first read your paper, I was kind of confused the first time because there are many concepts, but you kind of did not provide full explanation of these concepts and distinctions. But after I heard your presentation, I think the basic line of argument and reasoning is sound, but the problem is that you mentioned too many things, and your argument is kind of buried on the too many concepts, and yeah. So I think your reasoning is sound, but in general, I think you want to talk too many things at the same time in a short paper. So since the theme of this conference and the subject of your paper is followership, I think maybe you can you'd better focus on the meaning of followership and the case studies of the followership and its effective use. And the idea of followership itself, I think, is very provocative and interesting, and I like this idea because it gives kind of hope to other kind of weak countries and weak people, that you don't have to be worried about your weakness, and you can always be proactive and challenging, because the kind of structural environment of the system changes, and strong leaders also need consensus and listeners. So the methods, the basic methods that followers should very actively follow, and following itself do not have to be passive. That method, I think, is very good. But there are many to help you to elaborate your argument, I think some points should be made. The important distinction you made in your paper is also three different actors, but as Jung-hyun mentioned, there is some kind of conceptual confusion, and I think middle powers is kind of different concept with leaders and followers. It's not clear they are on the same dimension, and middle powers tend to be defined in a sense of its kind of resource power, not kind of functions and rules. So that's my suggestion. And you kind of distinguish three different approaches to leader and followers relationship. You mentioned about leadership approach, and second you mentioned about follower-centric approach, and third thing you mentioned something about how followers view themselves. I think this was the point you wanted to emphasize, but I did not think it it was given enough attention. About this third theme, you mentioned about Nepal's case in followers and learning flow to their strength section. You mentioned about Nepal's case and Nepal by proactively using their own followers' lore, I guess, and by doing some gaining some self-recognition. I think Nepal did something to Netherlands, right? But you did not actually explain what Nepal did to Netherlands and how Netherlands was persuaded to help Nepal to solve their solution. And because I think this is an important point to your argument, so I think you'd better elaborate on this idea. So, and yeah, that's my comment.
Thank you so much for to discuss for in such paper. So I have a couple of the questions and some comments on your paper, just building upon our to discuss and comments. So first of all, I was sort of wondering, what's the conceptual definition of the leadership or followership or middle power? So you just put it as a subtitle, what does it mean by leadership and middle power and followership? But as I think Jung just pointed out, the leaders are just creating issues here. So which means everyone can be either leaders or followers in that context. So it's very kind of fluid concept. So I wasn't sure what's kind of the conceptual kind of boundary there, how we really define leaders or followers. And you, during your presentation, you mentioned about either developing countries are more kind of followers in a sense, and the advanced industry countries, they are more kind of leaders in a sense. However, at the same time, they're middle power, but some of them, they are developing countries, and some of them are already advanced. So I wasn't quite sure how these three groups actually dividing into under the what kind of categories or some of the arguments there. And another point is, as one example, you mentioned about the ways in which the followers actually affect leadership decision in the especially climate change cases. So that's one example, but I was quite sure how followerships actually discussions during their influence actually changed the direction of the leaders' kind of issue framing or some agenda setting or some other kind of relevant issues in this area. So in your paper, if you elaborate that aspect, it'll be a more interesting paper. Okay, we had discussions by the two first students here. So I want to give some time to our two presenters. So you do not need to answer every single question. You can just, if you feel like you don't comfortable, you don't answer. That's fine. But if you consider it's kind of core questions, you want to elaborate or just provide some clear kind of, let's say, some the framework, you can just pick and choose. So how much we have time here? I will just check schedule first. So I will give you 10 minutes time to respond to either 5 to 10 minutes to respond to your questions and comments, and then I will open the question to the floor.
Thank you for the comment and suggestion. And first of all, I have to say that the original paper was up to 8,000 words, but I had to reduce like almost 3,000 words, so it should be lack of explanation, but you understand because I have to meet the criteria of the conference. And the interaction effect between the two variables, independent critical thinking and active engagement, was not significant. I did correlation analysis through SPSS, and it wasn't significant. And also the why I chose the Kelly scale is because this is the one validated scale I could find, because there was, for example, there was Zalzinic scales in terms of categorizing followers in terms of the dominance and activity. However, it wasn't validated, as well as it was mainly focused on dysfunctional followers. And the other one I was concerning, the other scale was courageous follower scale, which was the researchers defined the followers under the only in the relationship with leaders, and so I want to be more focused on followership itself. So that's why I chose the Kelly's followers, and also the network centrality, because I would like to choose the easiest way or more like easiest way to for answers, respondents to answer. It's because network centrality is not the main variable in the current research. also the question that you mentioned, like 2 questions, and which one was which. And first of all, I was advised to use a quote original question from the previous research, and also there was the past. Practically speaking, I got only 2 months, and then it was the best practical method that I could use, and because in 3 weeks gathering 124 responses, it wasn't. I have to admit that the adjust the survey to the time scale. Also, I conducted the regression analysis through SPSS that Min Sung-koo mentioned. That I included the gender and education variables, including this moderation and mediation analysis, and none of them was significant. And it was actually hard to find something significant, but thankfully, And this is a very this is a very important question. Is the leadership? What I suggest to followership, because the concept of followership could not be adopted in every country, because there are cultural, societal like elements is involved, especially because where I studied, the Netherlands is kind of one of the high equality among people. So maybe it was possible to research more easily, but I do think that the concept of followership will be changed as more like there should be a leaders, but the hierarchical, the status, the gap between the leaders and followers will be more decreased, reduced. And the professor mentioned how this independent critical thinking affects negatively or to the organizational application. It is because independent critical thinking are very evaluating. It is defined as evaluating and judging and making judgments and critical remarks, and they're more like analyzing situations. So when they analyze and they found the problems or negative sides of the organization, they would like to feel more reluctant, feel negative. This awareness of the negative sides could prevent them to feel more positive feelings to the organization, which actually could affect them, their organizational edification, in terms of that, they are less likely to feel oneness or consider them as a part of the in-group member of the organization once they found the problems in the organization. So, do I have time? And so I wanted to suggest in Korean organization, especially because in Hofstad scale, Korea is scored very high in hierarchy. So in this case, actually followers as considered as followers. So there should be a very high gap between the followers and the leaders. So this model might not be directly utilized and adopted by organizations for the moment. But however, like I mentioned before, the gap between the leader status and follower status will be it's getting to be decreased. So in the future, I strongly expect that the Korean organization will take care of more followers, more as one of the important group member of the organizations. Yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyun-soo, for your great response to the question, very different questions. And then we will turn to Eun-soo to discuss the comments and questions.
So thank you very much for the comments and the questions and all the suggestions.
So I would like to address the first question about the different classification, but also covered by the professor. So there, I guess the problem could have been anticipated in terms of my classification, in terms of kind of dividing it between leader, middle power, and followers. So what the difficulty was that, I guess, in some sense, in this kind of issue about climate change, it's quite difficult to identify leaders and followers, and there's no strict dividing lines as such. And so I guess in some ways you have to pick and choose. So in some definitions, in some literature, they define leaders as those who are very supportive of a very strong commitment to address climate change. On the other hand, I guess there's some literature that kind of tries to define leaders as nations with more power or influence within the negotiations. So not necessarily promoting more commitment, but the amount, but it's kind of proportional to the clout that they have in these negotiations. So I guess I kind of opted for the latter option in doing that. So I guess in some sense my classification was to make it easier to kind of understand by classification, but it's not really. It's not like a strict definition of which that, and even myself, I didn't really think that these countries I labeled as leaders were necessarily leaders in all aspects. And in fact, in some cases, for instance, EU may be leading in terms of carbon trading emissions, whereas other countries may be leading in terms of sustainable technology. So yes, I do take the point that it could have been quite confusing, but I guess I thought it might be easy to just kind of try to classify just to make things slightly more organized. So that was how I kind of dealt with the leader power, the leader classification of trying to kind of maybe perhaps correlate that with power and the kind of influence they have in these negotiations. But having said that, I do believe that even the followership framework that I want to kind of bring forward is where leaders do not necessarily remain leaders for all time, and followers can sometimes become leaders, and leaders can sometimes become followers in terms of the initiative that they take. So that's why I thought there was like a strong need to not just think about leaders and followers as such, but trying to talk in terms of relationship between various actors and stakeholders, which I thought would be, and I think it probably would have been more helpful if I talked more and focused more about that relationships, and and I think as mentioned about how they interact at a deeper level, rather than I guess just kind of talking about these are followers and these are and these people are leaders. So I hope that kind of addresses the point about the classification. Secondly, regarding the interdisciplinary study about the whole issue, so definitely it's a good point in the fact that the climate change issue is it's related to economic development. It's about equity as well, and I guess the discussion about more kind of long-term effects on how these countries would be affected by these negotiations would have been really interesting. And it will be an area that I would really like to look at. And thirdly, I guess, and you also mentioned the other levels of stakeholders, which I think is really interesting and something that I was considering whether I should include this or not, but due to various constraints. So I think it's really interesting the relations between government and civil society, and even within government, there's that difference between the provincial level, the local community, and the more like in the federal government, especially in terms of China because of the huge scale of the nation. And another thing that I kind of wanted to focus on, but didn't really get a chance to cover, was the effect of NGOs and how they play in terms of the negotiations and trying to get media attention on certain issues. So I know for a fact that a lot of the NGOs partner with both developing and developed countries in order to push for certain projects. So for instance, Norway is also involved in the UN Red Plus project, which is the reducing emissions through deforestation and forest degradation. So they're involved in various South American countries like Guyana, so helping communities monitor forests and protect forests. So yeah, I think it would be a great kind of it would provide another perspective in terms of a body that may not have like a policy, that might not have like a status of a nation, but still have significant influence in other ways. So In Ho's point about the need for more elaboration of the concepts, yeah, I definitely think that it would have my point would have been made stronger through more elaboration. So I hope I addressed the kind of difficulty with the conceptualization because I basically define the leader and follower and middle powers in terms of their kind of political influence rather than their functions and roles. Yes, and I guess the difficulty in terms of research and trying to find firm grounding was that it was quite difficult to actually look into the negotiations and know what each actor actually did and how. So I could only see the correlation, but not necessarily whether one was a causal relationships. So I guess that was a difficulty, but it would definitely be I think it's a fair point in saying that it should be an area that should be delved into further. So I hope I kind of touched upon most of the points, but yeah.
Thank you so much for your response, and now I will open the floor. So, including our discussion, if you have any questions or comments to either Hyun-soo or Inso, please raise your hand. And please identify your name.
Hello, do I need to stand up? It's okay, all right. My name is RJ Banta from the Philippines. I am currently with the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. My question is with regards to the second presentation of Ms. Kim about leadership in climate change. You have described how the different countries, the developing and the developed and the developing world, North and South, have somewhat an incomplete framework on how to work on climate change, and therefore there's a lack of leadership, and therefore you have said that there's a need for leadership, but as well as there's a strong need for followership as well, which you have focused actually, and as well, and I find it very interesting that you have added competition between the middle powers. If we look at these two different concepts, I think it shows the reality that we have in climate change. Climate change, as we know in international relations, is non-traditional security issue, and therefore there is a lack of urgency in the part of the states to address climate change. We have a bigger concept we have a more urgent calling for at least on the state level and then the negotiation table for disasters because it poses the urgency. But I'm not going to go there. The point is what I've explained a while ago is that the different states, the negotiations in the climate change and leadership in the climate change actually shows the reality in the international relations, which we see the lack of commitment between the different countries, not only for climate change, but in other issues as well, such as human rights and other different important issues. So what I'm saying is that perhaps climate change might not be as different to what have you been saying, an effective tool to bring the different countries together. I want to know your comment about this, and if you agree that climate change is an effective tool, in what way or channels will it be much more effective? Because based on what we see and based on what you explained and what I explained, it's quite hard to actually bring the different countries together. The second question is that you have mentioned about Nepal, Netherlands helping Nepal on its CCA and perhaps DRR, which is disaster risk reduction measures, by providing financial assistance, if I'm not mistaken. I think a little bit of technical assistance as well, if I remember correctly. But the issue here is that there would be a lack of ownership on the side of the developing world. So I would like to ask you kindly to perhaps shed a light on how is it possible for the developing world to actually have ownership if what you're suggesting is that the developed world should help and should post leadership towards the developing world, or the leaders, going again to the topic of the conference, leaders imposing specific tasks to the developing world. Right, thank you very much.
So I think the main point of the questions, first one is the climate change is quite a niche that is similar in terms of in other issues, international relation issue. The second is whether the all developed issue, including climate change, is it also relevant for the ownership issue, especially for the developing countries or the aid recipient country cases. So probably it's easier to just answer to one by one rather than collecting all the questions. So why don't you just answer to his two very interesting questions.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you so much for your question, Archie. And so I do agree that climate change negotiations in some ways a reflection of the current kind of international relations in general, in terms of, how different countries exert their influence, and in terms of, how, rather a lack of kind of commitment for a more like long-term goal because of policy myopia and all these kind of problems. But I think there are some distinctions that could be made between climate change and other kind of more kind of, I guess, urgent issues such as the global economic recession. So I think, like, in some ways, because of these kind of differences and the fact that the effects of climate change is so long-term, and because the harms are not distributed evenly, it's usually disproportionately distributed amongst many of either the low-lying islands or some of the sub-Saharan African countries that suffer from deforestation. That I think it can, in some way, you can see more of that kind of power disparity within the negotiations. So yes, I do think that that kind of framework could be expanded and could be extended to other issues such as global security. But I think the problem is I think it is probably more difficult for different countries to get to achieve a consensus in climate change negotiations, especially when there are like other pressing domestic concerns or more urgent kind of global concerns. Yes, but however, having said that, I think because if the argument can be made correctly and if the consensus could be gathered in terms of like the shared goal of an international community, so I guess same with kind of human rights issues, and it kind of shares that kind of what do we want to achieve as an international community. So if one addresses that question and try to actually try to persuade other groups and try to actually highlight the aspects where actually promoting these goals, these shared these goals could be of a national interest. And I think by making that point, I think would be really helpful in terms of getting more global consensus, not only climate change but also in other global issues as well. And secondly, about the ownership of developing countries, I think it's a very important point, and I kind of briefly touched upon this when I mentioned, I guess, many African countries kind of getting investments from many countries, including China, and so I don't think it should just be leaders saying that, oh, you need help, and thus I will help you, but but it's not. So I don't think that kind of patronizing stance would be helpful in any way. And I guess in many sense, the developing countries themselves know what they need the most. And a lot of these African countries know that actually what they need is sustainable technology, not just kind of resource extraction and building more oil refineries. So I think in that sense, kind of if they group together to form an alliance, and I think that would kind of. And in that case, take more of an initiative to really kind of put their point across on the table would be a more kind of, I guess, what we would expect from a good kind of followership perspective, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments or suggestions?
Please identify yourself, please.
Okay. Thank you for the nice presentation. I'm Misbah from Hanyang University, graduate school student. My question is from Hanyang Suli, the first presenter. Is the study investigate the empirical relationship between the followership and interaction with the leadership? I would like to know the data that has been collected is basically related to which kind of organization setup, either it's a service organization or tangible product manufacturing setup, first thing. And if the organization structure is important, organization structure means by project-based organization structure or cross-functional organization structure or functional organization structure, whether it has any particular role or whether that factor has been taken into consideration. And lastly, I would like to know if the co-worker size was taken as 5, the minimum one. Practically speaking, the organization work, the number of workers is not as low if you are taking small or even a medium-sized organization structure. Your comments, please.
Basically, the gentleman, he asked about the organization structures and the nature of this kind of analysis, and the other one is, I think he mentioned about the number of the people, how users they define as a threshold point. So probably he's asking some that you are the data survey and the structure.
Thank you for the question. And first of all, I especially mentioned that it has to be more than 5. It's because I aim to measure the network centrality. Network centrality should be measured so there are people to interact or socialize. And if there's a, for example, one-man company or there are 2 people, in this case, I figured out it is hard to detect network centrality in terms of the organization where it has 2 or 3 people. So that's in that sense I suggest that I included only the employees who are working in more than 5 people. And they, in terms of the data collection, I collected data through online, and it was recruited by email, random email, or random through the random community. So I try to protect the representativeness, and also in terms of the organization structure. Of course, the followership can function differently in every organization structure. My paper aims to mention that there is actually followership works for the performance of the organization, and followership can function differently across the organization. However, the main viewpoint of the this paper was mainly related to how in what condition, in what kind of communication climate followers can be more active and more can be contributed, can be more be an asset for the organizations. Yeah.
There was a lady who just want to ask another question.
Hello, my name is Min, and I was just wondering, I have a question for Ms. Lee, about hypothesis 1B, that you said ICT will have a negative relationship with organizational identification because people tend to notice the bad things about the company if they have independent critical thinking, but I was wondering what would happen if they find something positive. And same thing with 2B, because you said ICT will predict positive perception of communication climate because the comment is well heard. But I was wondering what would happen if the comment is ignored or for the opposite. Because I think you're only focused on one way, so I was wondering what would happen if the opposite happens.
Yeah, so in terms of the followership and communication climate, so independent critical thinking could be positively related to communication climate. You mentioned that what if communication climate is negative? Let's say more more like less open and less participative. In this case, communication climate will be mediating factor. So, for example, my hypothesis suggests that independent critical thinking had this negative relationship with the it is expected to have negative relationship with the organizational identification. So, when communication climate was involved as a mediator, then this negative relationship could be changed. However, this communication climate could score, let's say, less participative, less open, less trustworthy. In this case, it doesn't the effect of independent critical thinking becomes higher than when communication climate was more participative, positive, and open. That's I think you should understand in terms of the communication as the mediating influence. So it mediates the influence to the extent of the influence of the independent critical thinking on the organizations.
So any other questions or comments to one of our presenters? Oh, sure.
So Kim, you just said that you actually, what you wanted to do actually is kind of provide kind of non-dichotomous or non-essentialist kind of concept of leadership and policy, because concept can take both roles depending on the situation. But I don't have an issue with that. But when you do do some different kind of conceptualization, you have to provide some justification by providing kind of non-essentialist concept, because people usually take leaders and followers kind of essentialist concept or stable concept in some context, but you're kind of trying to kind of deconstruct those kind of concepts. But it is okay to do deconstruct concept, but you have to provide your justification doing it and what kind of positive effect we can have from kind of that deconstruction. And I think you kind of underestimate the importance of conceptual distinction, and when you try to clarify, kind of distinguish actors into leaders and mid powers and followers, you state that you kind of clarified it depending on the political influence of those three types of actors. But political influence is kind of very vague concept, and it's even vaguer than concept of function and role. And is it or comes from power or comes from material power or ideational power? You have to provide some explanation of those standards of distinctions. And even the concept of middle power itself is very contentious, and there are many disputes about is it really okay to use the concept of middle power in our direct understanding. So, and China is not usually considered as a middle power. So, I don't want to be kind of very criticizing, but I think it's better to put much more importance on using the concept.
Yeah. Thank you for the reminder, and I think, I will definitely keep that in mind. But I guess if I were to provide some justification for the reason I kind of classified it in that sense was because, so I guess my classification of leader and middle power and followers kind of followed the line, I guess, in terms of kind of economic development terms wise, power. So So many of the leaders I suggested, such as the EU and the US, obviously they're considered as economically developed countries, and the reason was that by having that status, you have more in terms of so financial resources to actually afford to cut carbon emissions, whereas for many of the developing countries, they just simply don't have as much room in terms of financial capability to tackle the issue. And I understand that China is a very contentious issue in the fact that, in some sense, China is considered as a climate laggard because it's kind of very reluctant to sign up to any kind of binding agreements, and it is considered as an emerging economy, but but it's, in some sense, people consider it as a leader in terms of the scale of its economy as well. But I thought the reason I can classify China as a middle power, I guess, is because it emerged. First of all, it emerged as a developing country, so without having kind of any significance within like these international negotiations, to having a much bigger role due to the increase in consumption of and the increase in carbon emissions per capita as well, and the fact that they are actually taking increasing role in these negotiations, I thought it would be reasonable to classify them as in a transition stage in some sense. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments from either discussants or from the floor?
Sure.
And sorry, to add one more thing, I think your paper might have actually even been more strengthened through a justification of whether or not the kind of global scale negotiation happening, usually through the UN, I would say, is even an effective way to resolve climate change. Because I think from the get-go, when I started reading this paper, I kind of questioned, I don't even think like nation states are, or on the scale of kind of governments communicating with other nations, is the right way to solve climate change. So either kind of saying in your giving context of what different ways climate change is being resolved presently and historically could also benefit your argument.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for the comment. Yeah, I think there's definitely a huge limitation in the UN to work along the UN framework, the UNFCCC, and it's in some sense, I guess, just more smaller level, like multinational cooperation, may be more helpful in terms of kind of making that piecemeal development. Yeah.
Any further questions or comments?
I actually have a follow-up question on Professor Lee's paper. So you mentioned something about how how oneness, the feeling of oneness, is very important in the organizational outcome and management. But I was wondering, what if this oneness, meaning that what if all these employees, they feel very, belong to one another, atmosphere is really good, but what if that oneness actually defies the leader's decision making? In other words, what if all the employees kind of group themselves together and they go against the leader? I was wondering about that. And related to that was, in your survey, you asked about what their current position is in the organization, and I realized that you have an option that says president. So president as in, does that mean that he is at the top of the organization structure? Is he the leader? Can you clarify on that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, the mentions. And then I think you're mentioning about the dysfunctional followers, which is like when they feel stick together and that they're against their challenge to the leaders. And actually, the Zalzniak's followership research deal with this type of dysfunctional followers. And dysfunctional followers are categorized as the dominant and activity, and then how much they are dominant in the group, within a group and organization, and how much they are active. So practically, actually, when they are active, there is a room, since it overlaps with the dysfunctional follower scale. Practically speaking, there's a room that if followers really actively engaging in the organization, there is a room that they're involved with the challenging with the leadership. But in this paper, the followership and leadership, the point of the viewpoint of this paper is more like focus on the followership and leadership. It's more in a harmonious way, and then there are really little hierarchical status observed between the followership and leadership. So when followers actively engage with, let's say, or their duties and their responsibilities, and it could lead the positive organization outcomes, such as the once they are more involved, they are more like committed, so they would want to become more like wanting to the organization become more developed or achieve the organization success. Yeah.
Yes, let me just say that I think both papers point out the changing nature of leadership and followership, and perhaps because of that difficulty of trying to define what leadership and followership mean. And I think, especially, whether it's in a corporate setting where, the relationship is getting less and less hierarchical, or in issues like climate change where sometimes followers have much more at stake than the leaders. So I think depending on the setting and the issue, there are so many different variables to take into account that, sometimes I think it's very difficult challenge to study the nature and issue of our followership. And if I may, let me pose a question to both presenters. For Ms. Lee, what do you think, is one way to promote active engagement might be to create a better communication climate, and maybe this is kind of changing the the direction of causality, but do you think that, or do you see any way where communication climate can improve active engagement? And for Ms. Kim, actually, when I was reading Ms. Lee's paper and kind of trying to see if there are any applications to Ms. Kim's paper, I was thinking whether small countries that are very actively engaged in this process, that have a lot at stake in this issue, might actually be kind of hampering the process of international conventions. Perhaps because when they most of the times, or at least when you look at the precedents, I think these countries get what they want by approaching different powers, and for example, Nepal to Netherlands, and African countries to China, and then kind of getting redress from that kind of avenue. But maybe that will provide an excuse for big countries to be less enthusiastic about international conventions. And so maybe having two active engagements might not be a good outcome for the international community as a whole. So maybe what do you think is a good or desirable quality that these followers should have if we look at the issue from the perspective of a benevolent social planner and try to arrive at the best optimal outcome?
Thank you. And as I mentioned in the presentation, due to the selection of the research design, there will be really the causal relationship could be hardly discussed, but it is really hard to discuss because active engagement itself is the behavior, personal, individual characteristic, and communication climate is like a perception of the group members of the organization. So one can affect actually give and take the influence with each other. So this could be the causal relationship can be established when you probably adopt like ethnography, or so if you like look into individual employees person by person. I think then in that case I could achieve that the future research could achieve the clear causal relationship between the individual characteristic and then the total perception of the organization communication climate. So it was hard to describe the causal relationship in my research paper. However, I do think my research paper shed a light in terms of that the followership hasn't been empirically tested, and there are some studies, but proportionally it lacks of the empirical confirmation of the hypothesis of the past research. So this causal relationship could be more discussed in the further research. Thanks. So I think your point about how, in some ways, that kind of like a smaller level kind of ties between developing and developed countries can be of a hindrance of, in some sense. So I think that could be a realistic problem if, like, I guess these kind of small scale like dealings become way too excessive in terms of kind of going beyond the existing framework. But however, I think there are some ways that the existing like UN conventions and frameworks could encompass these kind of, you know, other smaller scale multinational cooperation. So for instance, I guess like developed nations can claim credit for some of the transfer of technology and things like that to developing countries. So, so these issues are still being debated, I guess, in the international stage. But so regarding the quality of that, I would possibly ask for in terms of developing countries is that obviously I think their voice can be better heard if they come together, especially if they have shared issues and shared interests. So whether it be association of small island countries or sub-Saharan African countries. So I think those kind of like groupings and forming a really close coalitions to put their agenda across the table rather than just simply approaching it, you know, at a one-by-one level would be a more effective approach.
So if you don't have any further questions or comments, probably I will close our first session here. So please thank to our two excellent presenters, Hyun-soo and In-sung, and as well as our four wonderful discussants. Thank you.
We'll now begin the second session, which will be led by Professor Hyun-joo Jung from Yonsei University. Please welcome him with a warm hand.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Hyun-joo Jung from Yonsei University, and it's my great pleasure to serve as a moderator for this session, which is compared to the previous session. This is more hardcore IR stuff, so I think you might enjoy the second session. And let me introduce first our two presenters and discussants. To my right, Lee Na-young from Seoul National University. She will be presenting a fellowship in international relationship East Asia in the 21st century. And we have two discussants here. And to my right, Hae-jin Park from Oberlin College. And I just heard she's graduating and pursue graduate study, right? I'm not sure whether it's a right choice, but I hope it's a good choice for you. And Jung-min Yeok, right, from Georgetown University. She's a senior, right? Okay, right, sophomore. Okay, pretty young, right? It's a good time. Okay, and to my left, Raphael Kunz from Seoul National University. He just came back from Switzerland, Geneva, to present paper, right? And pursue summer course in Japan. And he will present a paper on fellowship in U.S. military interventions in the post-cold era. And we have two discussants here as well. Hyun-min Kang, right, from Korea University. He just completed courses, right? Doctoral coursework, and also Song Pyo-hong from Seoul National University. He's also a master's student, right? And like the previous session, we have two presenters first for each 20 or 25 minutes, and then followed by discussion about 10 minutes for each discussion, right? And then we're going to have open the discussion to the floor before summing up the session. Okay, let's go with first the Na-young about I think it's more about the theories, right? Or maybe she built up some theoretical framework to better understand the behavior characteristics of East Asian countries, focusing on ASEAN and North Korea, Japan, and Russia. So I think sometimes 2x2 metrics is fascinating, but at the same time, it might be misleading, right? Because it might push other actors behind without, which is not including the 2x2 metric. So we will have a 25 self-visiting first from Naya.
Hello, my name is Nayoung Lee. I'm a third semester student at Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. I know I have limited time and a lot to cover today, but before I begin, I would really like to thank EAI for inviting me here and a lot of colleagues and mentors who encouraged me to apply and gave me a lot of mental support along the way. And particularly, I really like to thank the two professors who commented on my first round paper. It was really great feedback, a little bit stimulating in a harsh way, but it really helped me crystallize and improve on my idea as well. And I hope I will get more of that today as I go. So with that, I'm going to begin. The topic is followership in international relations. So what I did is analyze what type of followership is being exercised in international relations in East Asia and to see if and how they're influencing the leaders. So this is the general overview of my presentation. So traditionally, the IR debate has been focused on superpowers or major powers, and small powers have been rather ignored or understudied. To introduce the theoretical debate, there are scholars who argue that states, regardless of their size, balance each other. On the other hand, there are scholars who argue that small states bandwagon because they're more prone to external pressure. And there are also scholars who try to seek a middle ground and say small states are unpredictable. So in essence, they sometimes balance and sometimes bandwagon, depending on the context. And for a long time, scholarship has been okay with just saying small states are unpredictable because they didn't play much role in the past. However, in the 21st century, especially in East Asia, the role of small states are increasingly getting more and more attention along with the question of rising China. So the question that are being asked these days is how are states in this region responding to the rise of China? And the general trend is to sort of expand and adjust the traditional terms. So first, there are scholars who argue that states are soft balancing China. So you can see how the term balancing has now expanded to soft balancing. And there are scholars who argue that states are accommodating China. So instead of bandwagoning, we use the term accommodating. And there are scholars who come up with an entirely new term to describe East Asia small state behaviors. Among them is Evelyn Goh, who coined the term omni-enmeshment, which is a concept that I'm going to explain as I proceed. So what are some limitations of previous work? First of all, there's no systematic tool for analyzing secondary state behaviors. Also, it overlooks small states' influence on the big powers. So there's a lot of talk about how big powers are influencing the small states, but not vice versa. And finally, it is focused too much on the rise of China when not all behaviors in this region is directly related to the rise of China. So in order to overcome these limitations, I took an interdisciplinary approach and adopted the work of Barbara Kellerman. She's a professor at Harvard Business School, and she does extensive research on the role of followership and how they influence and change the leaders. So to briefly introduce her work, she argues that in 21st century, because of globalization and information revolution, there's increasing phenomenon where states, followers with less power are influencing or even changing the leaders. And she argues that followers are doing this by engaging. And what does she mean by this? So she proposed this typology of 5 different kinds of followership depending on the level of engagement. So these are the 5 types. And as we go from top to bottom, from isolate to diehard, the level of engagement increases and so does the amount of influence. For instance, she classifies followers of Germany's Hitler as bystanders for not actively challenging Hitler from committing genocide. And she also classifies Voice of the Faithful as activists because they successfully accused and turned down the Catholic clergy leadership with many child sexual abuse cases. So the question penetrating her work is, how are followers influencing the leaders? And she answers that by engaging. So what I did in my research is to adopt and confirm her findings in international relations. So then why Kellerman? Why is her work important? And why is it important to adopt it to IR? First of all, her work provides systematic analysis. So it is a tool exclusively designed to analyze followers. Also, it shines light on the influence that followers have on leaders, which was missing from current IR debate. And finally, the impact of 21st century, such as this phenomenon that she mentions, permeates all fields. So Kellerman argues that these two phenomena has significant impact in the field of business, where she draws her work from. So it enables followers to create change and change leaders by using tools such as social network service and raising public awareness. And I argue that the same phenomenon has also similar impact on international relations. Globalization has brought on this complex interdependence where states' interests are closely connected. So this creates a two-way channel of influence. And also because of information revolution in East Asia these days, public opinion matters when it comes to foreign policy. So because of these reasons, I adopted her work into international relations, and I'm going to show you how. First, defining followers. Who are followers in international relations? Kellerman provides two different definitions of followers. First, they're followers defined by their rank. So these are people who have less power and authority within a given structure. And they're followers defined by their behavior. So these are people who simply act like followers. And over the course of history, we've seen many leaders who seem to follow rather than lead. So now Kellerman emphasizes that in her work, she defines followers by rank, not by behavior. So by rank, it implies that it is fixed and given within a structure. Also, it is relatively understood. That is, followers can be followers only when they're leaders, and vice versa. So now we turn to international relations. In IR, states roughly possess two types of power: hard power, economic and military capabilities, and soft power, that is the ability to influence the way others think. So as I mentioned, Kellerman emphasizes that her definition is by rank. So between these two different concepts of power, which one would more closely resemble the features of rank? I argue that hard power does. Hard power is more fixed and relative compared to soft power. So following this chain of logic, I define followers in IR as states with less hard power than leader states. So this chart provides a list of countries and their hard power, so economic and military capability. And as I've colored, the top two countries, US and China, assume the role of leader because of their preponderant power. And the rest are followers. Now, Kellerman did not differentiate among followers, but adopting her work into IR, I believe it is important to note that not all followers have the same rank in IR. For instance, Japan and Malaysia. So they're both followers in a sense that they have less hard power than the leaders, US or China. However, Japan clearly possesses much more hard power than Malaysia. So in this case, Japan would be a higher ranking follower and Malaysia would be a lower ranking follower. So this is where I expanded on Kellerman's concept. So now that I've defined the who of my research, I'm going to explain what they do. And the key here is that they engage. Then what is engagement in international relations? How I adopt it? In international relations, there are roughly two definitions of engagement. First, there's a broad definition. It's a policy that entails involvement and interaction as opposed to isolationism. And there's a more narrow definition. So it's a policy of using positive incentives to reward good behavior as opposed to containment. And in international relations, the narrow definition is more dominantly used, especially in terms of dealing with rogue states like Iran or North Korea. However, in my research, what I mean by engagement pertains to the broad definition. So in this research, engagement includes both positive and negative activities. So now that I've set the scene and defined and adopted the concepts, I'm going to propose a research question. In 21st century, how exactly do follower states with less hard power influence leader states and their foreign policy? Now, Kellerman would answer by engaging. And I try to confirm her answer as for the rest of the presentation. So in order to confirm her answer, I devised a hypothesis. First, follower states with lower rank and high level of engagement can exercise greater amount of influence. And I have the second hypothesis in order to confirm the first one. So to test this hypothesis, I devised an analytical tool. It's a two-factor model, and this model calibrates two variables, amount of hard power and level of engagement. And what I try to see is how different combinations of these two variables produce different outcome. That is, how much influence, whether it is high or low. So if you recall, the hypothesis involved states with lower rank and high level of engagement. So testing this requires testing cases that belongs to quadrant C. And in this paper, cases of ASEAN and North Korea were tested. And in the paper, I've also tested Japan and Russia in order to confirm the second hypothesis. But today, due to time constraints, I'm only going to highlight the quadrant C cases. So the first case, ASEAN. They're low-ranking follower with high level of engagement. And their type of engagement is appropriately termed by Evelyn Goh as strategy of enmeshment. So this is a strategy of engaging a state deeply into international society. So they enmesh big powers into this net of institutions. To visualize, this is a map depicting membership of all ASEAN-founded institutions. So there's ASEAN, ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Regional Forum, and East Asia Summit. These are all founded by ASEAN. And you can see how ASEAN itself began from a very small region and how they expanded to basically all over the world. So this is how they cast a very wide net of institutions. And how is this possible? Because of ASEAN Way. This is an institutional norm shared by all member states. It includes features like informal and loose connection, and strong emphasis on non-interference and consensus-based decision-making. So this norm is codified in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which is also signed by all members. So using this type of engagement, how are they influencing the leader states? First, they're influencing Chinese foreign policy. For a long time, China has had reservation towards multilateral institutions. They were viewed as attempts to contain China, especially because her power was growing so fast. But because of ASEAN Way, which required minimal commitment, and because it was initiated by a non-major power, ASEAN, this greatly reduced Chinese suspicion. So this is in clear contrast with the US-led APEC that China still holds much reservation towards. So now China is a participating member in many multilateral institutions such as ASEAN Plus 3, East Asia Summit, and ASEAN Regional Forum. And secondly, they're also influencing the US foreign policy, illustrated by the case of signing Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in 2009. So as you recall, this treaty is a codified version of ASEAN Way. And US has been very hesitant to sign the TAC for two reasons. First of all, TAC is a multilateral agreement, and US preference when it comes to this region, Asia, has been bilateral, such as their hub and spoke system. Also, TAC includes a strong emphasis on non-intervention clause, and US concern was that this would constrain her freedom of action in terms of foreign intervention and sanctions. Especially US, at that time, US was imposing heavy sanctions on Burma. So they were worried that signing the TAC would bind her free hands to actively interfere in Burmese affairs. However, despite these dangers, U.S. did decide to sign the TAC because there were also benefits of signing. First of all, TAC had extensive membership. So by 2009, U.S. was the only country in Asia Pacific to not have signed the TAC. So this created a sense of fear that they were being left out, especially when they were trying to carry out the pivot to Asia policy. And also, U.S. was trying to promote East Asia Summit as a new regional community. And as you recall, East Asia Summit is founded by ASEAN. And ASEAN said, whoever wants to join the East Asia Summit has to sign the TAC. So these two factors really strengthened the pro-TAC argument within the United States, so they finally decided to sign in 2009. So you can see how ASEAN shaped the environment so that it would be in the U.S. interest to sign the TAC. And now before I move on to the second case, I would like to make a quick point on how managing this high level of engagement is difficult. So at any given day, ASEAN members are constantly involved in a meeting preparing for a summit, a forum of some kind. So just to give you an idea, this is a list of scheduled international meetings that ASEAN countries host in a single month. So managing this wide net of institutions requires a lot of time, money, and resources. And so far, ASEAN has been willing to take that toll. So now moving on to the next case, North Korea. Low-ranking follower with very high level of engagement. And what is their type of engagement? Strategy of brinkmanship. So this is a strategy of invoking a sense of crisis by using these kinds of provocative activities. And so I've only listed the major events here. If you recall the 2013 crisis, the red blocks are the days that North Korea either launched a missile, conducted a nuclear test, or issued a declaration of war. So you can see how when it comes to voicing their claims or acting out to further their cause, North Korea is not shy. And using this type of engagement, they are influencing the leaders' foreign policy as well. Illustrated by the Banco Delta Asia case, they influenced the U.S. foreign policy. So in 2005, U.S. imposed sanctions on Banco Delta Asia. This is a bank in Macau accused of money laundering and circulating supernotes. And this decision froze $25 million of North Korea's funds that were in or tied to this bank. So for the next 2 years, North Korea responded by leaving the six-party talks, test-firing 7 ballistic missiles, including short, medium, and long-range, conducting the first nuclear test, and openly criticizing the U.S. at any given chance and to anyone who would listen. So what they did is they would come to the six-party talks and in the middle of negotiation just abruptly storm out and say, this is all because of U.S. sanctions and pressure, referring to the Banco Delta Asia sanction. So this kind of behavior and strategy went on for 2 years, and it gradually started to irritate other members of the six-party talks, such as China, Russia, Japan, South Korea. They were getting frustrated because the talks were not going anywhere, and the nuclear threat was destabilizing the whole region. So now these countries started to put pressure on the U.S. to relieve the sanction. And the U.S. finally caved in 2007. They decided to unfreeze the $25 million of North Korea's funds. So you can clearly see how U.S. literally reversed their foreign policy decision in 2 years. So these two cases confirms the hypothesis, which is my conclusion. So when follower states with low rank use high level of engagement, they can exercise high influence and even change the foreign policy of leaders. So this finding also has theoretical implication. This phenomenon of small states exerting a lot of influence is being witnessed a lot in East Asia these days. And the question is whether this is a 21st century trend that is global, or it is an empirical anomaly that is unique to East Asia? So this is a question that I hope to address in further research. And finally, I will draw some policy implications. First, states should engage, especially states with less hard power, because they can use engagement as a tool to overcome their material capabilities. And also, states should be aware of those who engage, because engagement has both sides. As Kellerman herself warned, activists, these are high engagers. They can be an asset, like ASEAN, or they can be a danger, like North Korea. So they should be watched and judged by fellow followers. Then why should other followers do this? Because when leaders do this, when leaders take care of small activist states, they tend to resort to forceful means. So my final words are that follower states should look after and surveillance each other as well as the leader. Thank you for listening.
Okay, our next presenter will give a presentation about the U.S. military interventions in post-Cold War era by looking at the Polish and Turkish decision with regard to military intervention in the Gulf War and Iraq War, yes. Led by the hegemonic country, the United States.
Hello everyone, my name is Rafael Kuntz. I'm very pleased to be here and talk to you about my essay called Followership in U.S. Military Interventions in the Post-Cold War Era. I divided my presentation in following areas. First, I want to give you some background information on how the Cold War setting was like, how was the international system just after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Then I will show you my research question, and I will give you a brief literature overview as well as the theoretical framework that I deducted from the literature. And then I will move on to my main part of my essay as well as presentation, the case studies. I chose Poland and Turkey as two followers in two particular military interventions led by the United States. And then I will show you my findings. The Q&A session is, of course, after in the discussion part. The post-Cold War era after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, from one day to the other, basically overnight, the US was the only remaining superpower in the world. And there was a world of one leader, the United States, as often called in IR literature the hegemon, and many followers, smaller states, so-called secondary states, or even third-rate powers that have not many capabilities at all, hard power capabilities. Yet the phenomenon is that despite the US was able to improve its overall security situation after the Soviet Union disappeared, the main adversary for almost 5 decades, the US became much more military active in the post-Cold War era than during the Cold War. It started with a lot of interventions, US-led interventions, mostly driven by kind of liberal, idealist foreign policy ideas to make the world a better place, to make the world safe for democracy, and so on. It started in 1991 with the Gulf War, which I will cover in my presentation as well as essay. Then some other wars, I didn't list all of them, it's not exhaustive. There are a lot of interventions by the US. More recently, the Iraq War in 2003, a very controversial war, of course. The Gulf War, on the other hand, was very broadly supported by the international community. It was seemed as international legitimate to intervene in the Gulf against Iraq, which had invaded Kuwait in 1990, and also it disrupted the flow of oil, and it was a threat to global peace and security. The Iraq War, on the other hand, in the aftermath of the 9/11, of the tragic terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, was very controversial because the US kind of related weapon of mass destruction, harboring of terrorism, and to try to legitimize invading Iraq and toppling the Saddam Hussein regime there, because there was a lot of controversies about this. The coalition force was much more smaller, and it was a coalition of the willing. I think it was George W. Bush which said, either you're with us or against us. and before it was more like a broader, the Gulf War was a very broad approach. When I was starting this essay for this conference, I kind of digged into the literature, and there was interestingly quite many little about followership, leadership relations in our scholarship in regard to military interventions. And yet, most military interventions by the US in the post-Cold War era were not fought by themselves. They always had indirect or direct support of followers of secondary states. So my research question is very broad and open. It is, what are the factors that motivate secondary states, so-called followers, to follow, to support the hegemon into a war, into a military intervention? The literature on the topic can be divided into the three main spheres of IR scholarship. The materialist approaches like realism, normative constructivist approaches, and liberal institutionalist perspectives. So the materialist approaches, they look at relations of dominance, relations of power. How does the hegemon get the followers to follow? Does he use side payments to induce followership, or does he even coerce followers to follow into war? The normative approaches are more the power of idea. Like the US always says, we want to spread democracy, and like-minded governments might have incentives to join an intervention because we are going against a bad authoritarian regime that violates human rights and so on. And the institutional perspectives are more looking at formal alliance treaties, like collective security treaties, how they work, and how they work as if one attacks, the other ones have to follow. Yet we have a peculiar situation in the post-Cold War era, at least in the first decade. The US had such a military and even economic supremacy that what realists would say balancing, and Nayeon talked about it very nicely, what realists expect that all the secondary states or followers, they would not just follow, they would balance at some point. That didn't really happen. Some scholars started to talk about soft balancing strategies, that is using economic statecraft, diplomacy, international law to kind of constrain the actions of the hegemon, and that can range from opposition to accommodation. And I found this very good kind of theoretical framework from a book that talks about followership, Jesse et al. They listed a continuum of responses, strategies by followers to the demands of the hegemon. So we don't need to look at the opposition, because we are in a time where opposition, China's rise was talked about by some scholars, but it was not in the headlines as now. So we're more talking about resistance to full accommodation, meaning bandwagoning, which is just to follow every demand or request of the hegemon. I started balking, the third one. Balking is just simply the follower refuses to demand a request of the hegemon. Just says, no, sorry, you cannot do that. Blackmail is they use they kind of threaten on like bad consequences in another field to the hegemon if the hegemon wants to coerce the follower into support. Leash slipping is a more long-term perspective strategy that a follower can adopt. It means that the follower builds up its own military capabilities, looks for other alternative friends and allies in the region to become less depending on the hegemon, to have a more independent foreign policy in the long term. Neutrality is self-explanatory. Switzerland is a good case. Then binding is more the institutional perspective, because this continuum is the weakness is it neglects the normative approaches, but it takes together the institutionalist and the neuralist approaches. It like synthesizes the two approaches. That's what I really liked about Jesse et al.'s approach here. So binding is using institutions to constrain the actions, international law, but also international organizations, like not vetoing in the United Security Council, for example. Bonding, on the other hand, is a strategy that is very supportive of the hegemon's intervention plans, but it has the aim to influence the hegemon's foreign policy in the long term to its own favor. So that could be a strategy that we will see Poland adapted very well. And bandwagoning is just, as I said, just following the demands of the hegemon, whatever it is. I read also an interesting paper about social psychological approach to followership in IR. It kind of argues for a more nuanced conception of leadership. I ran out of words to kind of in the conclusion part to bring that more in, but maybe in the discussion we have more time to talk about that. So rather than just using dominance, the leader could find very less costly ways and more effective ways to induce support by the followers for military interventions. Closely related to the bonding strategy is the security alliance dilemma by Scott Snyder. And in this dilemma, it is about fear of entrapment or fear of abandonment. So either a follower thinks, I'm too much depending on the hegemon. That's the fear of entrapment. The hegemon goes into a war somewhere else, and I have to follow. I have no choice, even if it's against my security interest or my national interests. Fear of abandonment is the hegemon doesn't really care about this follower, but the follower really needs the hegemon for its own security. So I have to do something as little follower to please the hegemon, that he helps me in a situation that if a situation of danger arises in the future. Generally, it can be said that followership in military interventions is kind of in the literature explained by either external and internal variables, mostly combined. It depends on the case of the study. So really have to look at if it's an external factor like on a systemic level or just regional level, or if it's domestic politics or even capacities that really matters. I mean, a lot of followers, they just don't have the capacities to go into each war because they don't have the military and the money for it. So for the methodology, I took the small n study comparison approach and really tried to do process tracing for two cases, Poland and Turkey, for two events, the Gulf War in 1991 and the Iraq War in 2003, or starting in 2003. Why did I select Poland and Turkey? Both very beautiful countries, of course, but also they are a little bit similar because they're both regional powers, Poland in Eastern and Central Europe, Turkey in the Middle East now, at the time of the Gulf War, more at the doorstep to Europe, a very important player. They both had, in both events, democratically elected governments, so they are not authoritarian regime, which would complicate domestic politics variable. They were both strong US allies. Turkey joined the NATO in 1952, Poland later, but maybe, as you know, Poland was a socialist country until the early 90s, so it was a Warsaw Treaty member. But just after the regime change in Poland, Poland really tried to become a NATO member early on, and finally was joining the NATO in 1990. And for the events, same location, Iraq, same adversary, Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. And I haven't found any study on using like a case study that just looked at Poland and just looked at Turkey for their behavior and their strategies during those wars. So I found it is an interesting extension of the existing knowledge that we have. So in all cases we have support, but to a varying degree. So the outcome is a bit different. Turkey supported the war coalition in 1991 strongly, but very weakly in 2003, very limited support. And Poland, on the other hand, supported both wars very strongly, even stronger in the Iraq War 2003. And now to the cases. Poland is quite easy to explain because we have not very much variation here. After the end of socialist rule, the country was in a turmoil, economic problems. There was this shock therapy on the country to introduce a free market economy. Nevertheless, Poland responded quickly to the US request to send troops, special forces, intelligence support, as well as warships. So even though number-wise it was a small support, it's very significant given the state of the country of Poland in 1991. In 2003, despite very strong domestic oppositions, around 70% of the Polish public was against the war. There was a massive anti-war rally in Warsaw and throughout Europe. And they provided ground troops for the invading force. Only one of 4 countries that provided ground troops, which is very astonishing. It was Australia, the UK, and the US, 3 Anglosphere countries, and then Poland. And after the invasion or the battle, the battle over Iraq was over and the Saddam regime defeated, they even increased the troops for the occupational period. Yet why did they do that? They had no direct regional interests in the region. Iraq is very far away from Poland. Poland is a regional player, but it's not big enough to have like stakes there. But they face at home regional uncertainties. And in the post-Cold War era, just after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Poland found itself sandwiched between Germany and that we didn't know what is going to happen after Germany was reunified. Will they rearm? Will they become like an imperial power again? And Russia. And so Poland was really looking for a hegemon to rely on, for a leader to rely on in security terms. It was looking for a security guarantee. And for Poland throughout this decade and until now, especially with the Ukrainian crisis again, Poland is really trying to be the model ally of the United States in every aspect. They want to be a new UK for the hegemon, for the US. The Turkey's case is a bit different because in 1991 there was substantial support. What Turkey did is they allowed access for air force and logistics for the Americans. They also allowed, they also stationed their own military into their southeastern region, 170,000 troops, and they kind of pretended that they would invade Iraq from the northern front, kind of stressing out the Saddam regime because they thought now we have to face a two-war front. But that diverted troops from the Iraqis to the northern border and made it much more easier for the coalition forces. They came from the south, from Kuwait, to invade. Yet that was the support question, but why did they support? There was a lot of debate in Turkey because Turkey has a Kurdish minority, and those are the marked areas. They're actually spreading throughout Syria, Iraq, Iran. Now we read a lot in the news about the ISI and the Peshmergas, which are now rearmed by the US. And for Turkey, the Kurdish separatists are a threat to their national integrity, to their national security. And they always cooperated with Iraq on that topic because Iraq was Sunni-led, very anti-Kurdish as well, and they cooperated in counterinsurgencies. They also had a very good economic ties, especially following the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 to 1988. So Turkey was very benefiting from its relationship with Iraq, with Saddam Iraq, before 1991. But now the US asked Turkey to stop this and even support a war against Iraq. And Turkey said yes, even though it was strategically, economically, politically very painful. And I read that the Turkish president at the time, Turgut Özal, he made a lot of personal efforts to kind of convince the policymakers, the elites, the parliamentarians in Turkey to bring about this support. He argued that we need the US as a security guarantor in this unstable and uncertain time following the global changes after the Cold War. Yet in 2003, Turkey was balking. They didn't provide extensive support, as in 1991. They provided very limited support. Actually, they just let the Americans use their own air bases which are stationed in Turkey. And the parliament rejected an extensive Turkish support for the US war coalition. The US asked Turkey to open its land border to attack Iraq from the north from Turkey, as well as actually that was WikiLeaks thankfully released. Also they asked for combat troops, Turkish combat troops. For the Turkish government, a very, very precarious situation because 90% of the Turkish people were against that war. Of course, also again the Kurdish problem, very important. Like getting rid of Saddam Hussein would really strengthen the Kurds in northern Iraq and would threaten Turkey. So I argue that Poland rationalized its contribution to US war efforts despite little to almost no direct interest in the region and even domestic opposition at home in order to bond Washington long-term as a long-term guarantor of its security. In the Turkey's case, in 1991 Gulf War, Turkey supported the US war efforts due to security uncertainty just after the Cold War. They was always talking about, will the world fall back into multipolarity? Will there be multiple player? Turkey was so much focusing always on the West during the Cold War time that they didn't have any allies in the Middle East. They were not interested in the Middle East. They wanted to stay out in the Middle East. And suddenly this collapsed, and they didn't know what to do. So President Özal was really like trying hard to strengthen this relationship with America again. But then in the Iraq War 2003, bulking and leash slipping strategy. Leash slipping because Turkey from 1991 to 2003 they had expanded their own military. They have changed their foreign policy dramatically. They have this new Ottoman approach that means they really embrace the Middle East now. They made a lot of Arab countries as allies as well. They are much more active in the Muslim world. Before they always were focusing on Europe and joining the EC, but with the new AKP government that just came into power shortly before the war, this has changed and has strengthened the foreign policy of Turkey overall and made it much less dependent on the hegemon, on the US. So my findings, I wanted to, with this case selection, I think it's very hard to make generalizations or to verify generalizations that exist, but I try to make new hypotheses that can be used for further research with other countries, case studies, or with the quantitative analysis. So hypothesis 1 is the higher the fear of alliance abandonment, the stronger the follower support for the hegemon's military intervention, regardless where this intervention takes place. Because a lot of quantitative studies, they take in the regional proximity of an intervention to say it makes it more likely that someone intervenes or follower helps the hegemon in this intervention. But Poland, as we can see, was far away from Iraq, but nevertheless supported every intervention. Because it has this fear that Russia might come again, or even Germany. Germany now less, because both are in the NATO, but Russia is still a very big threat to Poland. The second hypothesis is the more serious the regional level threat to a follower, the stronger is the support for the hegemon's military intervention. And by regional threat, I don't talk about Stephen Walt's balance of threat theory, which is more like, again, like it makes sense if my neighbor is attacking my other neighbor, then I want that my hegemon is going to help me out in this situation. But really, like, you have to look at each follower's own region and look who is the threat, who is the security threat to this follower, and then they might again join an intervention led by the hegemon. And thirdly, and that is specifically about Turkey, what I found about Turkey's reaction to the 2003 Iraq War, if a hegemon's military intervention contradicts a follower's national interest, domestic politics is utilized to legitimize a weaker support or even resistance vis-a-vis the hegemon. So Turkey didn't say no in just like, no, we don't do that, but they said we are also a democracy and we have our own inner workings. You have the Congress, we also have a parliament, and sorry, we cannot support you. But actually, it is now clear that if the AKP, they had a majority, that was the governing party in Turkey, they hold the majority in parliament. If they really wanted to push through the support for the US, they could have done so. But there was very much resistance, and probably the leadership of the AKP was very much relieved that they could deliver this message to Washington: sorry, we cannot support you in this case. Now, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you find it interesting. Thank you.
For the two, Rafael and Naya, for I think great presentations and very informative and sometimes ambitious, right, in some sense. So we're going to have two discussants, Haejin and Hyungmin. Hyungmin will give some comments or feedbacks or questions for the Naya first. Okay, who's going to go first? Okay.
first of all, thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to once again sit here as a discussant. Well, I don't know. Like, I don't know how to begin. How to give my comment on this. I am probably as nervous as the presenters at the moment. But to slowly begin, I found the paper, the quality of the paper I thought was good, and considering that the theme of this conference was a very difficult one. The concept of followership is, it lacks research literature, and as you mentioned, but it was a very interesting approach that you would take a multidisciplinary approach by borrowing a theory from business area and trying to apply this theory into your paper. I in particular really like this paper myself because I have this radical perception of the world as being a one huge global conglomerate. So coming from that framework and coming from that perspective, I had many things that I was able to identify myself with your theory. So as much as I like your paper, though, I am compelled to be the devil's advocate here by criticizing your paper and making your life a bit miserable. So I hope you understand my concerns. First, how I understood the main argument of this paper is that more engagement is better for followership states, meaning that followership states, by engaging more, can benefit more. But there additional thing that you've pointed out is that for leadership states, active followership states may be useful only if they follow in the direction of the leadership states want. If not, it may be actually bad, really bad for leadership case, as demonstrated by the North Korean case. So upon this understanding, I came up with several questions. But before I do, I think I should begin with my comment first, just for the sake of the context. Well, I thought the paper could be improved by adding one or more additional idea or context, if you please, although it may be a very difficult process in doing so. I think the power of followers lie mainly in the power of lobbying, or the power of negotiation, so to speak, which happens under the under national system. So it is pretty much hidden from our sight usually, so it is very difficult for us to research these areas, but I think still it is very important. And it has been demonstrated by this famous book called The Zero Lobby, written by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Wong. And there are also other cases where, in the case of Korea, there is a historical case where during Koryo Dynasty era, a famous diplomat called Seohee was able to negotiate with a powerful nation back then called the Koran, and he was able to win a huge victory, a diplomatic victory, by avoiding a huge war against them. And I think these cases could have been another good examples for your research. So why am I saying this is because in connection to the ASEAN case that you have mentioned, I was curious, or I was rather confused of how exactly the process have carried out so that the U.S. was able to conclude a TAC with the ASEAN, which means that what kind of negotiations were there, what kind of lobbying process was there. I think that was the big question that I had in mind as I was reading your paper. And another question that is led from this question is whether if we should see the ASEAN as a single entity or a single followership state. Because according to your hypothesis, reading your hypothesis, I got this impression that you are talking about a single state acting on its own to exercise influence as a followership state. But ASEAN is apparently not a single state, and it is difficult to say that even though it is under a multilateral institution, it's difficult to argue that it has a single foreign policy projections or aims, because each member state within the ASEAN have their own capabilities to conduct their own foreign policy. So I think that that point was the point where I got a little bit misled. So probably it could have been improved if the research focus was rather on the member, on a certain member within the ASEAN state, ASEAN multilateral institution, and how this particular state conducted a certain diplomatic fiat against the U.S. and triggering the U.S. to be attracted to this idea of concluding the TAC. And I think it's already a third question. I'm already losing my mind right here, but this concept of globalization that you have mentioned, and you have explained and you have given several characteristics of a world that is being globalized. And I think one other characteristic that I couldn't see in in your paper was this characteristic of that concerns with the question of external and domestic nexus of a state, which means that usually when we talk about international politics, we talk about both international politics and domestic politics and how it relates to one another. But this globalization is a phenomenon that is actually promoting the boundaries that divide external and domestic nexus to be diminished. So I believe that if we are to talk about this from a globalization perspective, then we should be able to not only cover the international level of this whole debate, but also the domestic debate that is happening in relation to the issue that you're addressing. Which means that we have to write a PhD dissertation for this. But I think these questions were some of the things that I had in mind. And there are some other questions that I have in my iPad. And these questions actually pertains to the other quadrant that you did not present during your presentation. It's about Japan and Russia. And I'll keep these two questions pretty simple. The first question is that according to the Kellerman's model, and I'm not sure, let me rephrase that. You use the Kellerman's model to explain that Japan, although it's a strong power, a strong follower, it has low influence. Because, and one of the reasons that you have attributed to this problem was that throughout East Asia there is a widespread anti-Japanese sentiment. And I was wondering how this particular concept of anti-Japanese sentiment, or this particular feeling, or maybe this maybe can be termed as identity, how can this be explained by Kellerman's model? That was the question that I had. And the other question is also similar. The only difference is being that it talks about Russia. So using the Kellerman's model, you have pointed out that Russia's lack of regional identity is undermining its influence as a leadership state in East Asia. So using the Kellerman's model, how can you explain this lack of regional identity of Russia using Kellerman's model? These were the two questions. Oh, and I forgot. One last question, sorry for taking too much time. You said that Kellerman defined followership by using 2 points, one being the rank and the other one being the behavior of the certain agent. And I think she deliberately pointed out these 2 points. I think she pointed out these 2 points as a component of a followership state for a reason. And but even so, you have used only one principle, which is the rank, and you did not look into the behavior part of followership. So the question that arises from that is, what implications are there when defining followers by rank as opposed to behavior? I believe rank is based on recognition among members within certain organizations, while behavior doesn't necessarily need recognition. Do states recognize such ranks? Wouldn't it be more accurate to look at followership of states from a behavioral point of view? These are my comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a lot of questions reading your paper, but a lot of questions are actually answered listening to your presentation. And actually, I had a lot of similar questions that Hyunmin just asked. So I'm quickly going to go over the questions I had. So I wasn't really sure why you chose the Asian and Russia as case studies, because like Hyunmin mentioned, Asian is not really a single state and is a group of entities. So for a fair comparison, I think you should have chosen another like individual state. And also for Russia, so traditionally it's not really considered as part of East Asia, and I know that it has impact on East Asian countries. But since you're attempting to answer the question of international relations in East Asia, I think you should have chosen like other East Asian countries, like more like real East Asian countries like Taiwan or South Korea or China. And also, many of the terms you're using throughout your paper were a little bit unclear for me, including the level of engagement. So when you talk about the Asian, you say you mentioned that the level of engagement of Asian is high, probably because innate other countries like China and US join their league and follow their values. But for Japan, you mentioned the level of engagement of Japan is low because it didn't initiate its own treaty, and it rather trying to join another treaty initiated by another entity, which is the United States. I'm talking about TTP. And how would you differentiate these two types of engagement? Because it seems to me that they're like all of them are practicing engagement. So I wanted to hear some clarification. And also, you talk about different amounts of influence, and it was a little bit unclear for me. For example, like you talk about Japan, and it doesn't really have an influence because it has like low level of engagement. So I thought you could probably clarify those terms. And also, in abstract, you mentioned that hard power is an independent variable, but I don't know if I heard it correctly, but during your presentation, I think you mentioned hard power is dependent variable. So I was wondering if you could clarify that. And yeah.
So I have also comments and some questions, which most of the questions overlap with Haejin's one and Hyunmin's one. And let me just briefly talk about 3 points. The first one is about concepts. The second one is your general the settings about the use of the concept of fellowship. And the third one is about your case selection. The first one, the concept. So sometimes we use a concept for a better or deeper understanding of phenomena, right? So we use the concept of fellowship. So having said that, what do you think is the value addedness of using the fellowship as a major concept in your paper? Does it help you to better understand the phenomena, or is it really necessary to use the concept? Because I didn't see the connection between the fellowship concept. Even without using the concept of fellowship, I think I can better explain why they behave that way, like ASEAN and North Korea in that sense. So I'm just wondering, what do you think why they're using the fellowship help us to better understand their behaviors, right? That's the first question. The second one is about your general framework, general settings. So you mentioned your paper title is about the East Asian IR in 21st century, right? Which is different from the 20th century in the sense that there's a less globalization, right? Although in the early phase of 20th century is much more globalized than these days, maybe to some scholars. And then the end of Cold War, right? But at the same time, Asian countries are not that much different from the 1970s and 80s because we already have much more interactions, and trade interactions and financial interactions in the 1980s and 1990s, right? So, but the other one, your main factor is the information revolution, right? But the information revolution, which is one of the primary causes of the followership in the 21st century, but I'm not make the connections between information revolution in 21st century and the IR in East Asia in 21st century, right? What may be the connection between these two? Because in that sense, North Korea's case selection is not, I don't think it's a good case selection because it's far out of the information revolution, although there's maybe 3 million people using cell phones in North Korea. But at the same time, because one of the key things by using the information revolution is that we need to more activities of civil society or NGOs, right, in their East Asian IR stuff. But in your explanations, all the other actors, the main actors, are state actors, right, as a unitary actors. Even you mentioned about the ASEAN as a unitary actors, right? So that's my second point. And third point is about case selection. I just talked about ASEAN and North Korea because you present two countries. So you mentioned that the acceptance of China and U.S. Of the TAC as a norm, right, as a confirmation of your argument, right? Was he really confirming your hypothesis, right? That's my question. So is he really influenced by TAC? I think some hardcore realists, they might say it's cheap talk, right? You might agree with the TAC, but at the same time, the U.S. and China might just neglect it and just do whatever they want, right? Is it really influencing their behaviors? So China's behaviors and U.S. behaviors, beyond just signing or agreeing with the TAC, is it really changing their behaviors, foreign policies, right? In that sense, I think it might be better to look at other cases, not just by designing the cheap talks by the hardcore realists signing the TAC, but I think more better explanation or phenomenon or observation might be the financial cooperation, like Chiangmai Initiative, because China and Japan, maybe the leaders in East Asia, which is signed and commit they have a binding commitment to as a resource pooling in Asian countries, ASEAN three countries. So I think it might be better selection for your case, how the ASEAN countries actually engage in China and Japan, even in South Korea, to join the Chiangmai Initiative, multilateralization these days, as a regional leaders and regional followers. Right? And the second point is North Korea. As you mentioned about North Korea's the Banco Delta Asia cases as a confirming cases, right? The North Korea actually infect or influence the U.S. behaviors, right? But is it really the U.S. North Korea change the U.S. foreign policy, right? It may be true, right? But at the same time, U.S. defroze, right? Defroze the Banco Delta Asia not because of their behavior, North Korean behaviors, maybe because of North Korea promise to stop or delay their program, right? So it's not just for North Korea's activities, but because of the U.S. changed state, not because of U.S. North Korea's behaviors, but because North Korea accommodated, right, to the American foreign policy, not by doing the nuclear development or nuclear tests, right? So even in that sense, still there's lots of economic sanctions against North Korea, right? How can you explain that if North Korea is successful in changing American behaviors, right? So in that sense, I think your case selection, I think you can choose other cases to better explain your hypothesis and test hypothesis. Okay. Let me go to the second presenters and discussants, and we'll begin with Songpyo and also Jungmin. For each of you, 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Songpyo Hong, and I'm from Seoul National University. I would like to also thank EII for inviting me here for 2 consecutive years. It's my honor. And I would like to also congratulate all the finalists through surviving the competitive competition. And one good news for Rafael is that the paper that I commented last year became the first prize winner. So wish you luck on that. And I'd have to say that commenting is much more easier than writing a paper, so please understand me for becoming the devil's advocate here. And going into the comments, I think this paper was interesting in the sense that it chose Poland and Turkey as, in the case of military intervention, because these fields were largely understudied. So in that sense, I think it was quite interesting to see how Poland and Turkey reacted in terms of military intervention. Going into the limitations, I would like to just make 5 comments. First is in terms of literature review. To my understanding, the role of literature review is to find the limitations and the drawbacks of previous literatures in terms of your topic. So basically, your topic here is what are the factors and the motivations secondary states choose to follow into war with the hegemons. So basically, this is talking about the military intervention. However, your literature review, for example, Waltz, Mearsheimer, Waltz, and Jesse, these are all in terms of military alliance. Military alliance does not necessarily mean military intervention. It becomes a precondition, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the next step. So your literature review in the paper is mostly on how states balance or how they react to threats, not in terms of how they what's their motivation in terms of abandonment, in the fear of abandonment or entrapment. So I think you need to refocus on your literature review. And second is in terms of methodology. You said that you're going to use process tracing methodology. Process tracing methodology is not just simply stating the process in a sequential manner. It's about finding the relation between the connection between the independent variables and how these independent variables affect the dependent variables. For example, if we are talking about the security dilemmas of Japan in the post-Cold era, you have to select an independent variable, for example, in 1950, 60, 70, and 80, and see how this independent variable affects the dependent variable throughout these periods. However, what you have done, to my analysis, is not a process tracing methodology, but rather just enumerating past historical events in a sequential manner. Third is in terms of your labeling of Turkey's strategy as balking. I couldn't quite understand why you have labeled and evaluated Turkey's strategy as balking. Because evaluation can come from 2 sides. First, evaluation can come from the demander, the one who requests. In this case, it would be the United States. Second, it can come from the demanded, the one who was requested. In this case, it would be the Turkey. Now, you've explained the terminology balking, and according to Jesse, it's a situation where a state ignores the demands of the hegemons. And this is focused and in terms of the perspective of the secondary states. So it would be right to take the case and the evaluation in terms of Turkey's perspective. So looking at what Turkey did in terms of the request from the United States, you said that it was balking, but as in your paper you mentioned that they did 2 things. First, they tried to pass the bill to authorize Turkey's intervention into Iraq. Although it failed by 264 to 251, still, what's important is that they tried. Second, what's more important is that although the bill did not pass, Turkey allowed U.S. access to air bases and Turkish soil and overflight rights. So in this sense, didn't the Turkey try even harder than Poland in the sense that they supported the U.S. despite the disapproval from the parliament. Then the question is, how can we call this ignoring the demands from the hegemon, or balking? Now, if this is the case, which I thought it was rather a cooperation than a balking, the two case selection that you made, Poland and Turkey, the first, in the initial sense, you said that these two were different cases, but ultimately, in a sense, they both cooperated. So I think these two case selections are not different, but rather same. So it was quite difficult to understand how you can compare these two cases and bring a meaningful message from these two. The next one is in regards to Poland. On page 6 of your paper, you mentioned that the Poland's expectation for the war compensations were largely not met. And on page 9, the conclusion of this paper, you stated that the leader-followership relation between the US and the Poland are exemplary. My question is, if the expectation of Poland were not met, how can this become an exemplary case? So I think this is, in a sense, contradicting your argument. The last comment is in regards to the overall analysis of the paper. The impression that I got was that I could not understand your own argument. What I mean by own argument is not just simply stating and summarizing the arguments of other scholars, but your pure argument that you're trying to deliver through this case. You mentioned 3 hypotheses in your conclusion, and I found 2 problems. First is that I cannot find anything new, different, or unique from the previous arguments in regards to entrapment and abandonment. It's very similar to the arguments that are already made by Glenn Schneider and Victor Cha and David Kang. So the wording is different, but the core idea is pretty much on the same page. Second, I couldn't quite understand how these hypotheses can contribute to the understanding of theme of this conference, which is a new approach to understanding leadership. So in the overall sense, I think it was quite difficult for me to understand how the cases of Poland and Turkey, which both are not different but rather same, can contribute to understanding followership and leadership. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much for your great presentation, and considering the fact that there isn't much research done on this topic to build on to, I think it was a really smart choice of you to choose case studies to provide concrete evidence when there isn't much existing theories or research done on this topic. Also, I think it was really great that you underscore the role of followership, especially with burden sharing and its increased responsibility put on secondary states as well as hegemons. And you focused on the motivations of follower states in relation to hegemons, but I felt a little lost in drawing connection between the research question and the prompt itself, in that the essay seems to focus on the motivations or the driving forces of the follower states, while I feel like the prompt asks for the behavior or the strategy of the secondary states and its subsequent impact on the hegemons or the leaders. So I have 4 questions regarding this essay. So the first one is related to the concept of followership. So my understanding of followership is that it comes hand in hand with leadership. So it's a reciprocal social process in which one thing complements the other, and it can be seen as separate entities. So in this sense, I would like you to give more or explain more, expand on the definition or the concept of followership, and perhaps mention some examples on what makes an effective follower. Second question is regarded to power and threat. So in the hypothesis or in the findings, you mentioned that fear of abandonment in regional level threat causes or prompts follower states to join the cause or support the leaders. But also in body paragraphs, you mentioned strategic partnership and alliance as means to reinforce power in developing or in building a relationship with hegemon. So power and threat are intertwined concept, but related to the Cooper's argument that you mentioned in the introduction, in which Cooper mentions that followership through leadership rather than dominance, I interpreted leadership as power reinforcing in parallel to alliances, and dominance as threat. So I want for you to expand on your understanding of power and threat and its relationships. Thirdly, it's related to multilateralism that you mentioned in the introduction of the essay. So you mentioned that the U.S. promoted multilateral institutions to create new global order. So I was wondering how the supporter states or the follower states can contribute to actually, in order for them to flourish or function well as a multilateral institution rather than one-way unilateral one. Final question is regarded to your example of Turkey. So you mentioned that the public's avid opposition to join Iraq war led the leaders to provide only limited support for U.S. in the case. So could you perhaps give more examples on how the public utilized followership in the case to drive the leadership rather than passively accepting the leadership's position?
Okay, I think there are great comments and a little bit harsh, right? And I think it will help you guys to revise or further research the topic. And my question is very similar to the other two discussions. The first one is very same with the first comments. I think without using, as you said, right, there's very few new kind of addition, right, to the existing literature. So I think there should be something added, right, a value addedness by using the concept of followership, right? So what do you think is the why you use the followership, the concept of followership? It will help us to better understand the Turkish and Polish behaviors, right? And the second one is like the case selection issues. I think the two countries are pretty similar, but at the same time very different, right? There's the geographic issues, and also they have totally different, right? The geostrategic context. So I think one of the key problem in small n cases is how to select the cases, and why do you think that these two cases are comparable with each other, right? That's my second question. And because of time constraint, we have about less than about 30 minutes, so we will give you about 7 to 10 minutes for each presenters to respond to comments and questions, and then we will open the discussion to the floor.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the suggestions and comments. For Hyunmin's comments, your ideas on how to add on to improve my paper, those are all really great, especially to look into the details of negotiation, what kind of arrangement or lobbyings were going on. I think if I could add to that, it would really strengthen the argument that I'm trying to make. And also, in terms of ASEAN as a single entity, I absolutely agree. It's a fair point that I should clarify that I will going to treat ASEAN as a single entity, and it is very vital for my research to consider ASEAN as a single entity, because part of their influence comes from acting together, these small countries. So I think if I can add that explanation, it would be helpful as well. And in terms of the globalization and external and domestic politics, the two-level game aspect, I absolutely agree that because of these aspects are becoming intertwined, small states can definitely use internal politics, domestic politics as a way to influence or as a way to use as an excuse. And I think that point has already been mentioned by other scholars, and I think Raphael mentioned it towards the end as well. And in terms of Russia's identity in East Asia state, I define Russia as an East Asia state in terms of how it's viewed as a Northeast Asia state, especially participating in the six-party talks. And it is true that they have this sort of dual identity that they view themselves as a part of Europe and also kind of Asia. And especially these days when Asia is getting more attention with the rise of China, they're trying to make more of a presence in this region. So in that sense, I classified and added Russia in one of my cases. And also in terms of clarifying the level of engagement that you asked about, so by level of engagement, you asked how I should differentiate between ASEAN's level of engagement and Japan's level of engagement. So it's not that they exercise different engagement, it is that they exercise different amount of engagement. So engagement in Kellerman's work and also in my work, the concept itself is very broad. So it incorporates essentially all activities. So I did try to quantify these engagement in every diplomatic exchanges, but due to the word count and the time limits, I decided to go for the relative scale. So it's not that bystanders don't engage. They do engage, but less than activists. So in essence, from bystanders to diehards, they all engage. But the key question is how much? So the concept here itself is very broad, but the whole idea has to be in a relative scale. So the model itself has more utility as a method for comparing two states of lower rank, higher rank, and more engagement and less engagement, rather than as an index to put in every single country in the world. So in that sense, the broad concept of engagement has limitations in that it remains broad, but it also has strength in that it can explain things that could not be addressed before. And also on the professors, your points on the information revolution, right? So globalization and information revolution, I chose these two because they were the concepts explained in Kellerman's book. And the purpose of bringing that up was because Kellerman explained that these two aspects created an environment in which it became easier for followers to exert more influence by various means. So I try to set the scene by saying that the same phenomenon has also impacted international relations to create an environment where it would be easier for smaller states to exercise more influence. So, for instance, information revolution has made covert diplomacy more difficult than before. So, and it has also triggered a lot of democratization movements. So, these days, it is very difficult for a large superpower to conduct a secret negotiation with a small power where they would exchange economic gains with political leverages. So, in that sense, because the public would not be able to accept such deal. So in that sense, that's how I set the scene that would help followers exert more influence in this century. And also the case of TAC, it's a fair point that to question whether this is really because of ASEAN or it could be because of something else. And in reality, in diplomacy and IR, everything is a chain of action and reaction. So it's very difficult to really isolate a slice of it and then say this caused that. But I chose the case of TAC signing because I wanted to take a more recent case into account, and I wanted to explain the case where ASEAN would utilize the strategy of enmeshment. And your suggestion about the Chiang Mai initiative. And I think if I could look into that case and add it onto the analytical framework that I devised, it would certainly help strengthen my argument. But the only difference would be that for the Chiang Mai initiative, in that case, the superpowers had a lot to gain from the Chiang Mai initiative, the financial gains from trade. Whereas for the signing of TAC, superpowers has less to gain in that case because they have more power, so they would like to exert more influence. But the TAC would, in a way, prevent that by emphasizing the non-interference. So that would be the only difference, but adding that case would certainly strengthen my argument. And also the case about North Korea. So I am in no way suggesting that followers, by using engagement, they can exercise more influence than leaders. They can't. It's simply impossible. But the essence of my argument is that they can use engagement to make superpowers do things that they otherwise would not. So this is the kind of tool that they can utilize on top of economic or military capabilities, whatever little that they may have. And shining light on that could be the added valueness of talking about followership. So this type of followership that I mentioned in my research is by using engagement, and especially a lot of engagement. So that could be how I contribute to the existing literature.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your valuable comments and critique. First to you, Songpyo. Literature review. I might should have added that I'm really focusing on alliance partner of the US, on NATO members. Poland in 1991 wasn't a NATO member yet, but that was also a way to gain access to NATO because actually there's a treaty that was signed after the unification of Germany that would not have allowed the Eastern European states to join NATO. So I really want to focus not just on all the followers, but in case of military interventions, really on alliance partners of the United States. To your comment to process tracing, I agree with you. I think I would have also needed more words. I was a bit overestimating when I wrote the first abstract. Actually, I wanted to use much more cases as well, more time cases in the events to really kind of find all those independent variables and make connections for the outcome. So that's a very valid critique, I think. Turkey's response, I think it was balking, and for the following reasons, because, of course, Turkey didn't just say when the first, I think it was a Deputy Secretary of State, which visited Turkey in the aftermath of the Afghanistan war to kind of set the stage for negotiating the support from Turkey for the Iraq war. And of course, Turkey didn't say, oh no, for the first time. They tried various strategies how to balk and how to sell that balking to the United States. So balking, I could only explain it in one sentence. That doesn't mean like just ignore, like we shut down our embassies, the Turkish embassy in Washington, and we just don't get the phone anymore. It means you get the request from the hegemon or the leader, but you try ways how to limit your support to the minimum, absolute minimum, and that was Turkey did, because Turkey would have been a very, very substantial support for that war. Once the geographic location, it was a second front. Actually, Turkey believed that the United States needs Turkey to actually start a war. So when they denied land access, so there was no soil, there was only overflight rights. When they denied land access, they hoped that the war would not happen. They overestimated or underestimated the military capabilities of the United States, which actually used paratroopers in the Kurdish regions in northern Iraq to make a second front nevertheless. So I think Turkey really responded in a balking strategy. Then expectations of Poland were not met. That is true in the sense of they hoped, as I think all coalition members of the coalition of the willing in the Iraq war, including the United States, to gain a lot from that war. Oil concessions and so on, like investing in the country. I believe South Korea as well got those promises by the US for kind of incentivizing this support. Even Poland, because Poland is very depending on Russian oil, and I mentioned Russia is a security threat for Poland. So if your potential enemy is like your main deliverer of energy, that is also an issue. So Poland had a lot of expectations, but they were not met. But we must bear in mind the expectations of this war were also not met for the leader itself, the United States. I mean, it is a disaster, the whole region after that war. And so Poland went in, but one thing happened. It really still strengthened its relationship with Washington, not to the extent special relationship like UK, US, as Poland maybe hoped or dreamed of, but still US always refers to Poland as its main partner in Central and Eastern Europe. And it is also interesting that the US presidents regularly visit Poland. Every American president has so far visited Poland in the post-Cold War era. So the hypothesis, what I want to contribute to the existing knowledge is the regional threat-based theme. So those studies and empirical research that I read, it was always talking about the regional threat as being, it has to be in the region where the intervention takes place. So there is incentives for the follower to support. So in the Gulf War, for example, Egypt supported even Syria. Syria is an enemy, a long-time enemy of the United States. They supported the intervention in Iraq because for them Iraq was a greater threat than, or a more immediate threat than the United States, which is far away. So that is the interesting thing about the Polish case, as well as the Turkish case, just on the other side, because Turkey is very close to Iraq. If Iraq really has weapons of mass destruction, it would really have reasons to want to topple that regime, but it didn't, because for Iraq, another regional threat, a sub-national regional threat, the Kurdish separatists were deemed as a greater threat to its security. Then to your question, Jong-min, thank you very much. You talked about the concept of followership as a reciprocal social process, and you said what makes an effective follower. So I think those case studies kind of show that a leader should really care about the genuine interests of its followers, also about the cultural settings. Especially in the Turkish case, the United States were so sure that Turkey would just support this Iraq war because it's a long-time NATO member, and because it doesn't benefit anymore after the Gulf War from its relationship with Iraq, because there were sanctions, there were the oil for food program, but Turkey could not benefit from that. So America's rationale as a leader was, if we replace Iraq with a democratic government that we top-down install, Turkey will benefit from that. They will reestablish economic relations, and they will have good relations as before the Gulf War. But that didn't happen. So I think it's really important that the leader looks at its key allies, at its key followers, and looks what is the situation on the ground. How do those people think, and how do those people view the situation when it comes to military intervention? And that was very much neglected in the coalition of the willing in the Iraq War. Then fear of abandonment, regional threat. 2 minutes left, sorry. I really a little bit forgot what you wanted to say with fear of abandonment, but you also talked about multilateralism and how can followers benefit from multilateralism. I think this is in a similar theme, like multilateralism in that sense can kind of course, the post-Cold War institutions, even during the Cold War, a lot of those institutions were established, like the Bretton Woods institutions, by the US, but followers using those institutions can also restrain the actions of the hegemon. But in the Iraq War, we could see that even a UN Security Council veto was not enough to stop the US. So I think followers really have have incentives to use institutions because it's a way to set an agenda, to voice their view, their worldview. Each state has their own worldview, and so I think multilateralism would be important, and I think the American government has also kind of changed in that way after the Iraq war. Then to your question, Professor, concept of followership. I think it's also to Jungmin's question about, I think really a leader should look at the situation on the ground, should look how a follower situation is, and not just use dominance and coercion in some cases. And the case selection, I think I chose those cases mainly because I was really curious, because on all the cases we have a lot of knowledge, like we know why Japan did not contribute troops, but significant monetary support in the Gulf War. But Poland and Turkey, they have varying degree of support, and plus they're both regional powers, and both they're members of NATO. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the other presenters' responses to the comments, and I think that there's some people in the audience here might have some questions or comments for the presenters, and please raise your hand or identify yourself, and any questions will be okay.
Probably this wasn't your main point, but just in your comment, you said that there's kind of no way that followers is able to kind of, so unless the followers really kind of the followers' goals is in line with the leader's goal, it's kind of pretty much impossible for followers to completely change the direction and influence leaders in the same way the leaders can influence the followers. But surely, but would this be a great way in terms of kind of defining followership in the way that we probably want to shape the world or international relations in the future? So, is it actually a good way to actually rule out the possibility? Yeah. At all, yeah.
Is there any other questions? Okay.
Thank you for the question. It's a great point. So what I mean by, I wasn't suggesting that leaders would act only if followers' goals are in line with the leaders. The core of my argument is that followers can shape the leader's interests. Followers can shape the shape the environment so that it would be in the leader's interest to do what the follower wants the leaders to do. So this is sort of like a soft power concept. So their interests could be different, and they will be. But instead of exerting force, using force like leaders would do, followers can work around that interest and shape the environment so that leaders would judge for themselves that it would be in their interest to do what the follower has planned previously. So that's the kind of direction and aspect that I wanted to highlight. Accommodating is definitely not a type of leadership that I wanted to highlight of followership that I wanted to highlight in my paper. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Just one short question to Ms. Nayoung Lee. So I was wondering, there is this general argument given by liberal scholars that states would be better off if they engage, if they cooperate. And how do you think your argument is improving on that general understanding given by liberal scholars?
So my argument would be, if I were to affiliate my argument with grand theory, it would be more closer to constructivist than liberal institutionalist or liberal peace theory. Because it's the engagement, what I mean by engagement isn't always positive. As you look at North Korea, not all states are better off by North Korea engaging a lot. But engagement is an option that small states can use, and they should, because they don't have much option. So engagement is a way to influence the perception of leaders instead of influencing them with force. So that's the kind of argument that I want to add to the existing constructivist argument. That is, that it can be a tool to shape, to construct an interest that was not there before.
I think in some sense, I think it might be better to go to the basics. I think as Hyunmin said, that there are several motivations for the secondary state or followers to follow the leaders, right? Maybe self-interest, right? The followers can change the cost-benefit calculations of the leaders, right? And then that might be one of the ways to do that. But I think, as you said, sometimes followers can shape or make the norm, right, as more acceptable for the leaders and the logical appropriateness, right? And then by doing that, shaping the norm of the cooperation or engagement, leaders can see that as appropriate, right? As a climate change or something like that, right? But I think we need to go further than that because that's too simple, right? So I think under what context or conditions or at what issues, right? The followers use that different types of strategy, right? By either changing the interest of the leaders or changing the international norms, right? So in that sense, leaders, in fact, don't follow the followers. Leaders follow the international norm or interest shaped by or co-shaped by the leader-follow interaction, right? I think we need to go further, not just beyond the behavioral characteristic, but the conditions and context or under which the followers do use the different types of engagement strategies. I think that's our future research topics for all of us in the fellowship. In that sense, I think the fellowship in IR is underdeveloped, right? And because, or even maybe we already know a lot about the fellowship, right? In some sense, but we don't have analytic framework to better understand. Sometimes you use the concept to better understand, as I've talked to you before, but sometimes you use the concept to put the reality into the narrow defined concept, right? Which is lots of other interesting phenomena by using fellowship. So we need to broaden the concept of fellowship and leadership interactions to better understand reality, not the other way around, right? Okay, any other questions? Okay, I think that the last question might be whose question? No? Don't look at the others. Be the leaders, right? Don't follow. All right, go ahead.
I just have a very short question. You kind of mentioned, it's the first speaker, I'm sorry. You kind of mentioned that ASEAN is an important factor in your paper, right? So ASEAN itself, it's a multinational organization. So any form of engagement you have with ASEAN, you're not just engaging with one country, you're actually engaging with the whole region, right? So your engagement with a region, in my opinion, is different when it comes to engaging with just one specific country. So my question is it possible for us to actually view engagement with ASEAN and engagement with a single state in the same framework? Or, yeah, how does it work with your paper?
Thank you for the question and the last question. So I've treated ASEAN as a single entity, and I really should explain why I did that in the paper, and I'm going to do that right now. So ASEAN has been, these 10 countries have been, they're not a single state, but they have been very coherent and strictly emphasize consensus-based when it comes to decision-making that would affect any one of ASEAN member states. So consensus-making basis, which means every state has to agree. Even if one country disagrees, they would go on the negotiation. So that's where the ASEAN way is also termed, where you talk everything to death. They talk a lot until everybody agrees. So in that sense, they're still holding their ties together. But like you just mentioned, if they were to break off and have discord among themselves, then I would no longer be able to classify ASEAN as a single entity. But my assessment is that so far they have been doing that, especially in terms of the signing the code of conduct in South China Sea area. It is in interest with some ASEAN countries, but not with some others. So they have not been able to reach an agreement yet. So so far, I would treat ASEAN as a single entity, and I would definitely, as I improve my paper, I would definitely add how I did it and the motivations for it. Thank you.
Right. To verify the question, no one? All right. So I think including the two presenters in previous sessions, the presenters they put really great efforts to finalizing their research, and I think, as you said, right, it's much easier to criticize, right? And then, as graduate students know that better than I do, right? So, than writing the real new things, maybe. So, join me in congratulating on two presenters and previous presenters in finishing. But maybe there may be more way to go, right? The revising, right, which is more painful than writing, right? And also the thanking all the 8 discussers to give, I think, really constructive and helpful comments and suggestions. Sometimes it's harsh, but it's much better, right? To revise when you revise in the dark your room, right? In your dorm or wherever you are. It's hurting, right? Sometimes it hurts. It hurts a lot, but as much as it hurts, it helps a lot as well. So I hope you can, all the presenters, accept that comments as a goodwill. And let me join us thanking all the presenters and discussants.